Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. December 27, 1999 Observer Newsletter WCW Starrcade Review, NWO Reforms. By Dave Meltzer. The idea to turn WCW around is the same idea Eric Bischoff came up with that helped turn WCW around 3.5 years ago. The most important thing about the revival of the NWO with Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Bret Hart, and Jeff Jarrett, all holding the major WCW title belts, as the final act of the December 20th Nitro in Baltimore is not whether it was just copying something from the past. Of course it was nothing original. But the object of wrestling is not originality. The important question is whether or not it will work. The answer to that question should be obvious in weeks, not months. But if you're looking at TV ratings this time for your answers, as most everyone will, you're about to be greatly misled. The subject of Vince Russo as WCW booker-writer has been a polarizing issue, both inside and outside of the company. It's basically come down to two arguments. His detractors point to the ratings not improving, falling last week to the second lowest mark in years, and use that as the argument that his new concepts of what wrestling is aren't working. His defenders claim it took 6 months to turn the WWF ratings around, and it'll take 6 months to turn WCW ratings around, and blame TNT standards and practices for nixing basically irrelevant wording and angles as to the excuse on why they've started a decline in recent weeks. There have been people internally complaining to Bill Bush that the new concept of wrestling without wrestling isn't working and isn't going to work, and Bush's reaction has been that they have 6 months to 1 year to make it work because anything less would be unfair. There have been people complaining that it's too inside for the casual fan, and that's why the ratings aren't moving, or that they're only perpetuated WCW's image as the company filled with past their prime wrestlers by importing a new crew of retired wrestlers while not seriously pushing one wrestler under 30. But both sides largely miss the boat by basing the entire worth of everything on the ratings. First off, the ratings are going to turn around. It's as simple as cutting Nitro to 2 hours, thereby eliminating the third hour that's a drain on the average, and football season ending. Thunder won't be getting its ass handed to it by SmackDown, and should be at the very least back to the 2.7 level it was doing before SmackDown destroyed it, and that 2.7 was a B-team show as opposed to an A-team show, so the numbers should be well above a 3.0 as in its glory days it topped a 4.0 regularly before it was destroyed from within. The NFL season, which siphons 1.5 to 2 million viewers each week away from the Monday night wrestling shows, will be over. Russo and McMahon are going to, if ratings are the only judges, look like geniuses in just a few weeks. That's the illusion of playing the ratings game when the playing field is about to undergo major changes. On July 26, the last week that Monday Night Wrestling didn't have competition from either the NFL, or on August 2nd, by the Woods vs. Duval Golf Showdown that, surprising as it sounded, did a number on the wrestling audience that week. The two shows over the head-to-head period combined for a 10.26 rating, or roughly 11.9 million viewers. That number on December 13th and December 20th had dropped to 8.56 and 8.57 combined head-to-head ratings respectively, and 9.9 million viewers, which is roughly the level it has averaged since the NFL regular season started. Has wrestling's popularity really fallen 17% since the summer? Hardly. That's why in the stat comparisons we make, we always compare them with the previous time last year, so those factors are taken out of the equation. One would suspect most of those viewers to be back in January, and with each show now getting half of its time in unopposed form, the average for each show will skyrocket. What should constitute a real improvement for WCW? If WCW is averaging 3.2 under Russo, taking out the third hour would immediately jump that same figure to a 3.4. Adding its share of the NFL viewers coming back should increase that figure to all the way up to a 3.7 to 3.8. That's what Nitro should average once it goes 2 hours with no real improvement literally in a few weeks. And when it averages that, people will proclaim the business as having been turned around. The reality is that WCW's Monday ratings, while not having moved since Russo took over, the company's Monday ratings are in better shape than under Nash. The Thursday numbers can't be fairly compared. House shows are in far worse shape, and pay-per-views, which were plummeting with a totally embarrassing Wrestle War, have at least stopped the plummet but have shown no signs of doing anything impressive either, nor have been very well received by the general public. But any trained monkey blindfolded throwing darts at the wall should also be able to be what Nash did. The reality is, until it beats a 4 as a 2-hour average, nothing has really happened, but well before it does, we'll be reading everywhere about a 20% increase in ratings since the NWO angle took hold. For WCW to lose an hour of Nitro advertising from its budget, the ratings have to increase to make up for it. As mentioned before, from a TNT standpoint, if you figure their 10 p.m. programming to do a 1.7, it means for them to make up the lost advertising revenue, Nitro needs to increase its 2-hour average versus its 3-hour average to gain the same number of viewers for the night, roughly 0.6 of a point, or to the 4.5 to 4.7 range before the shift in time becomes profitable for the station. For WCW ad sales, losing an hour of Nitro is even worse to the bottom line because the most of the production costs are the same for 2 hours as 3 since people are already flown in and the same equipment is still used. Unlike TNT, which can put another program in the 10 p.m. slot and make up some of the lost ratings, WCW is not adding another program. Now they will benefit on the shift of Thursday to Wednesday because it's the same number of hours and theoretically the ratings unopposed should be way up. Because of that, to point to numbers today as a balancing act is almost impossible to say where they have to be better off. Looking at it in 2 months will tell the story. But theoretically Thunder going unopposed should increase ratings enough to offset the loss of the 3rd hour of Nitro on Monday. Should in theory doesn't necessarily mean it will or won't in practice. It also should be noted there is the inherent advantage of why the switch is being made in the first place. 3 hours is just too long. It's a change that simply needed to be made. A calculator may tell you that 1 more hour of wrestling on Monday adds more money to the company because of an hour more of ad sales, but there is a long-term burnout rate from overexposure that a calculator can't understand. But the point while everyone gets mired in ratings points is that while everyone uses real numbers over the next 2 months to give, depending on their standpoint, fabricated conclusions, the real answers should be obvious, and in the most obvious place. Do people buy tickets to the shows? If they do, they're interested in the product. Do people buy merchandise of the performers? If they do, those performers are over. The fact is that Nitro on December 20th in Baltimore sold 4,589 tickets. Thunder on December 14th in Mobile sold 1,797 tickets. Those figures are total embarrassments. Per cap merchandise sales hit an all-time modern era low last week, barely over $4 per head. When the company was hot, those figures averaged more than $10 per head. Fewer people buy tickets than before. And to those who buy tickets, fewer buy merchandise than at any time in years. That's 2 months after Russo took over. But it was also before his big angle shot this week to revive the NWO. After being promoted as a major show for months in a legendary building that's closing down for the final show of the millennium, the December 27th Nitro at the Astrodome in Houston had sold less than 6,000 tickets at press time in a building that holds almost 10 times than many people. Those numbers are the reality, because neither Raw nor the NFL have much of anything to do with them. Thus far there has been no progress in that department even over the levels when Nash was in charge. There is an amount of truth to the fact that in many of the cities they are suffering from all the non-caring and no-shows and cockiness that produced such poor shows from the boom period that led to weak crowds of today, turning fans off in droves, and it's hard to get them back. But those same excuses could be given for WCW in early 1996, when they came to cities with tons of no-shows and bad house shows. But the Flair Savage angle, which predated the NWO by 7 months, sparked a 37% increase in house show business over the period of exactly 1 month, although the company stayed it for most of the next year before the second huge jump in early 1997 when the company was catching fire for a number of different reasons. But up until this point, the only evidence out there is that the new concept has not led to fans getting more interested in the product, debating issues over whether it's good or bad or creative or not aside. For a company of that size, the ticket sales of the past few weeks indicate right now they're at ground zero. Quite frankly, there is almost no place to go but up. But part of the blame for being at ground zero has to go not just with the people who started the decline, but also with those who hadn't, at least as of Monday, done anything to change consumers' views. Unlike ratings, which take time to grow, house show business turns around at the first sign of a good angle. It's as simple as Flair takes Savage's ex-wife and Savage goes for revenge. Michaels comes back after a career-ending injury. Hart returns after a hiatus. Austin gets hot. The NWO gets hot. The reality is, even with far less money spent on promotion and a far weaker crew promoting it, ECW could probably come very close to the same figures if it scheduled a TV taping in both cities. It will take months to get ratings turned around in a meaningful fashion, although circumstances will dictate ratings going up almost immediately no matter what. That's not a fake excuse. It did with WWF as well. It takes one successful angle to turn arena business around almost immediately. If the NWO angle is a success, can't be determined by 1 week or 2 weeks worth of ratings, or no noticeable real movement in ratings right away. But if people will look at ticket counts, they'll know by the end of January one way or another about the conceptual changes and the strength of the angle. The WWF bottomed out when it came to television ratings in late 1996 and early 1997. Ratings started to show a real jump after the 1997 WrestleMania, which shock coincided with Steve Austin's babyface turn and gained momentum from Mike Tyson, McMahon vs. Austin, and as the product became more risque over the ensuing months and years, and finally became competitive with WCW by early 1998. But from an attendance standpoint, WWF started turning it around in February 1996 when Shawn Michaels returned after his career-ending injury, after being in the dumps from April 1992 through January 1996. But attendance fell again through the second half of 1996, coincided with the departure of Bret Hart, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, and fell again when Jim Hellwig flaked out. A combination of the return of Hart in the Austin era starting saw a noticeable turnaround in January 1997, and during that year, the year that WCW kicked WWF's ass in the ratings. The fact is that WWF attendance increased almost 20% to set the stage for that happened with the ratings months later. By 1998, a turnaround followed, and in the spring the company was on fire. The final pay-per-view of the century ended with a repeat of the most talked about match ending of the last 1,000 years. The Montreal finish, which I guess now goes down with the dusty finish as a wrestling terminology, complete with the reference by Scott Hudson, announcing his first pay-per-view alongside Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan, that it was Montreal all over again, ended the main event on a flat note and led to generally negative reviews to a show that had some good wrestling and very good crowd heat early. As expected, Bret Hart was in the role of Shawn Michaels, the unexpected winner who pretended to be surprised by the match outcome. Bill Goldberg was in the role of Hart. Apparently Vince Russo had decided that WCW blew it when they had Hart in that position, an opinion shared by virtually everyone in the world, and is going to show what he would have done had he been the booker at that time. Making Goldberg the biggest star in wrestling coming out of this. Roddy Piper was in the role of Earl Hebner. Russo, who never came to ringside for the quick bell ring out of a sharpshooter, I guess becomes Vince McMahon. This all happened before a flat crowd of 8,582 paid, with 3,217 comps out, and a gate of $362,550 on December 19th at the MCI Center in Washington, D.C. For better or for worse, it was the new Russo concept of wrestling PPVs. There were 13 matches and virtually nothing screw job finishes. As compared with the past several WCW pay-per-view outings, this was a big improvement, largely because the writing was tighter and because the wrestling, at least some of it, was better. Chris Benoit and Jeff Jarrett in a ladder match put on one of WCW's best matches of the year, and both men virtually stole the show. Jarrett, who wrestled a fairly good bunkhouse match with Dustin Rhodes earlier in the show, was a last-minute replacement for Scott Hall, who blew out his knee, and then favoring it, injured his groin on December 13th Nitro and will be getting the knee scoped in January. Hall is expected back in action by late February, although he did participate in an angle the next night on Nitro. While WCW didn't acknowledge on Thunder the possibility that Hall wouldn't be there for Starrcade, they at least released it all over the internet that Benoit would still wrestle a ladder match and that Hall wouldn't be there. And at least to their credit, Jarrett put on what was probably a lot better match than Hall would have under the same circumstances. While there is bound to be the natural resentment of Jarrett because he's the one getting the promotional push largely because he came with Russo from the WWF, to his credit, he is working very hard, and the guitar gimmick because of the noise and the debris flying everywhere does get over. There was also strong consideration given to Ric Flair being put in the spot since it would have gotten a huge pop. But for their purposes, the choice was better long-term. The show had its other problems. The Cruiserweight title can't be destroyed any more than it already has with the champ jobbing on every television show in 2 minutes leading to this match, so the idea that it's on a woman hurting the title is irrelevant. The Varsity Club angle appeared to be a flop. Kevin Sullivan, at 50, looked awfully old to be a college jock, although Mike Rotunda seemed as if he'd actually turned the clock back since his last stint in WCW. Steve Williams refused to do the job for Vampiro, creating a really weak DQ ending in their match, and with his All Japan tour pending, that may be it for him with this company. Vampiro vs. Oklahoma, due to the physical interactions of Oklahoma with the Misfits, was total amateur hour. Diamond Dallas Page carried David Flair to his best performance to date, but it still wasn't a good match by any means. Sting vs. Lex Luger has been done a million times, and this angle was an excuse for Sting to take time off so he can be repackaged. This downtime for Sting was a decision forced on him rather than time off that he asked for like in the past. The less said about Kevin Nash vs. Sid Vicious the better. The latter match was great. And the main event could have been a very good match, except the finish ruined it. Hopefully they'll get mileage at the other end from the finish because it sure didn't work live. The show abruptly went off the air at the finish, just like Montreal. The only problem is, everyone knows about Montreal and it became a huge topic of conversation because it was a shoot. The same finish as a work has been repeated on so many indie shows and WWF shows so many times that people were groaning. 1. Vito LaGrasso and Johnny the Bull, John Hugger, defeated Disco Inferno, Glenn Gilberti, and Lash LaRue in 9:39. These four spent all week at the power plant working out a match, and their effort showed, as this match was a real hot opener, which was no easy task because their angle is so silly. LaGrasso in particular did a hell of a job. This was probably Johnny's 5th or 6th pro match, and he showed a ton of potential. At one point the two turned a double hip toss spot into a double power bomb on Inferno. Johnny slipped on the ropes trying to jump to the top but recovered quickly enough to come off with a twisting leg drop. Disco was staggered and LaRue was thrown into him, and he gave LaRue a stunner, or last dance. LaGrasso then used a high implant DDT to pin LaRue. After the match, Tony Marinara came out with a body bag and they put Disco in it, carried him to the back in their car and drove off, apparently to take Disco to their leader. 3¼ stars. Chris Benoit came out to his new music and new entrance trying to give him the look of a star. There are little things being done to really push Benoit and Jarrett. Benoit was given the US title since Hall wasn't there, but said titles should be won and lost in the ring and issued a challenge to anyone for a ladder match for the title. 2. Medusa, Deborah Michelli, pinned Evan Courageous in 3:32 to win the WCW Cruiserweight title. Courageous came out with Spice. Medusa came off the apron with a crossbody. Courageous decked her. Medusa used a second rope missile dropkick and was slammed off the top. Medusa nearly killed him with a messed up power bomb. Fans were chanting boring just as Courageous hit a pretty nice looking plancha on her. Finish saw Spice turn on Courageous, giving him a low blow and Medusa scoring the pin with a German suplex. Spice left with Medusa. That isn't the last time a finish almost exactly like that would be used before the night was over. 3/4 stars. 3. Norman Smiley retained the hardcore title beating Meng, Yuli Fifita, in 4:29. They ended up backstage where Smiley ran and hit after they messed up the catering area. Meng no-sold a lot of headshots and even no-sold a fire extinguisher. Fit Finlay and Brian Knobbs attacked Meng and he was holding his own with both of them while Smiley was hiding. Knobbs threw coffee on him and Meng wore out Knobbs with a garbage can and put the death grip on him. Finlay hit him with a chair and later a pipe to finally lay Meng out, and they left. Smiley came out from hiding, saw Meng laid out, crawled over timidly and pinned him. After the match, Meng put the death grip on Nick Patrick. 1 stars. David Flair was given a present of a solid gold tire iron. They showed Oklahoma on the screen and the fans groaned. This was not good heat heel. The Misfits then kidnapped Oklahoma and later put him in a cage. 4. The Revolution, Troy Martin and Dean Simon and Perry Sotelo and Christy Wolf, beat Jim Duggan and the Varsity Club, Kevin Sullivan and Rob Reich-Steiner and Lawrence Rotunda, in 4:53. Christina Lom, Kimona and ECW, came out as the cheerleader for the Varsity Club, who were Duggan's secret partners. Since Duggan worked the whole match, it was awful. The poor guy battled back from cancer, but his offense looks horrible and slow, which looks worse because the guys oversell it like crazy. Then he never sells anything, plus he's so big he makes his opponents like Saturn and Malenko look like midgets. Douglas, with his torn bicep, was at ringside doing commentary, so it was 3-on-4. Duggan worked the entire match. There was one spot where the Varsity Club came in for a brawl and Sullivan did the 3 of Woe gimmick to Asya before they all turned on Duggan. Sullivan gave Duggan a low blow and Douglas came from the announcing spot and hopped into the ring to score the pin. Hudson should be more alert because if he can hop off the announcing area into the ring whenever someone is knocked out in WCW and get credit for a pin, he could develop a Goldberg record in just a few weeks. After the match, the Revolution buried Duggan under their flag. This finish ended up being changed as the original idea was for the Revolution to do the janitorial work for 30 days rather than Duggan having to renounce his U.S. citizenship. -1 star. 5. Vampiro Ian Hodgkinson beat Steve Williams via DQ in 5:02. Oklahoma was at ringside in a cage doing the announcing and would have to wrestle Vampiro if Williams lost. Apparently Williams refused to do a job because the news would get to Japan where stuff like that matters. It really doesn't matter much anymore to the fans, but all Japan doesn't look highly upon it. Vampiro did a plancha off the cage onto Williams. Williams launched him in orbit with a belly-to-belly superplex. Williams destroyed the Misfits, who's getting involved physically took the match down. Vampiro hit one spin kick, tried a second, but Williams caught him with a back suplex. Williams then knocked down ref Charles Robinson for a cheap DQ finish. 1 3/4 stars. 6. Vampiro pinned Oklahoma Ed Ferrara in 2:52. Vampiro was laid out and Oklahoma wanted at him, but was still locked in the cage. By the time Doug Dillinger unlocked him, Vampiro recovered. OK hit a lousy DDT and tried to run, but the Misfits stopped him. Vampiro used a Uranage and the Misfits were pounding OK around. Vampiro used his nail in the coffin for the finish. Horrible. -1 1/4 stars. 7. Creative Control, Ron and Don Harris, and Kurt Hennig beat Booker T, Booker Huffman, and Midnight, and Marie Crooks in 7:53. Before the match, Stevie Ray and T had a falling out and Ray didn't even come out, so it was 3-on-2. It was announced that the winning team would become top contenders for Hall and Nash's WCW tag titles. Ray eventually came out, but T told him to leave. Finish saw Hennig hit T with a foreign object and Don Harris pinned him. The cameras totally missed the pinfall. 3/4 stars. 8. Jeff Jarrett pinned Dustin Runnels, in 11:21 in a bunkhouse match. There were so many references during the show to Dusty Rhodes that he has to be coming back. Dustin bleached his hair back blonde. Jarrett took out Rhodes' knee with a wheelbarrow. Rhodes slammed him in the wheelbarrow. He later clocked Jarrett with the cowbell and posted him. Rhodes took ref Billy Silverman and tied him up with duct tape to the ropes and taped his mouth shut. Hennig came out while Jarrett was whipping Rhodes to untie the ref and pull the duct tape hard off his mouth. That must have hurt. Jarrett used a 2x4 on Rhodes. They traded near falls until Rhodes used the Shattered Dreams kick on Jarrett, but Hennig pulled Silverman out of the ring. He then gave Hennig the Shattered Dreams. The match ended with both men brawling near the entranceway. Rhodes bulldogged Hennig on the floor but was then prey for Jarrett to come off the ladder that was there for the later ladder match, with a guitar shot on Rhodes for the pin. 2.5 stars. 9. Diamond Dallas Page Falkenberg, pinned David Flair, in 3:26. Page did a really good job of carrying Flair to at least a not bad match. Flair came out of the crowd in disguise and attacked Page with a tire iron. Charles Robinson then awarded the match to Flair because Page couldn't continue, but before Dave Penzer could make the announcement, Page threw him down. I guess that means the match continues even after the ref stops it. Flair's work didn't look nearly as bad as usual and he even got a big pop for using the figure 4. Page reversed it and hit the diamond cutter for the pin. After the match, Page gave Flair another diamond cutter off the ropes before Daphne Unger, the Flair stalker, saved David. Page was about to use another diamond cutter on Robinson but for whatever reason spared him. 1 1/4 stars. 10. Sting Steve Borden beat Total Package Larry Full via DQ in 5:25. If Sting won, then Elizabeth would be out of her contract with Luger. When Sting and Liz were backstage, Sting switched cans of mace with the one Liz had, saying he had a more high-powered can. This pretty well gave away he knew Liz was doing to turn on him. Fans were chanting steroids big time. I'm pretty sure Elizabeth isn't using steroids. Of course Elizabeth went to turn on Sting and sprayed him with the mace, but it turned out to be silly string. The angle had zero pop. So much for the comedy. Sting hit a splash off the top for a near fall, facebuster and 2 stinger splashes before putting on the scorpion. Liz grabbed Sting's bat and Sting stopped her. Then, for some unknown reason, probably because Sting didn't want to come across as being duped since they've done that to him for 10 years straight but couldn't figure out a way out of this, he simply turned his back on Liz and she gave him a hard shot with the wiffle ball bat for the DQ. After the match, Luger threw Johnny Boone over the top and put Sting's wrist in a chair and Luger destroyed the wrist and gave several baseball bat shots to the arm. They went for major heat on this one. 1 stars. 11. Kevin Nash beat Sid Vicious, Sid Audi, in a Master of the Power Bomb match in 6:58. Actually this was worse than it sounded on paper going in. Another ref bump, this time by Mark Johnson. Sid's back was bleeding a little. Sid used the power bomb very clumsily, but Johnson didn't see it. Jarrett then ran in and KO'd Sid with a guitar shot. Nash twice went for a power bomb but couldn't get it because he was selling his back from getting the power bomb. He then simply told Johnson, who saw Sid laid out, that he had power bombed him while Johnson was out and Johnson raised Nash's hand. Boy, was that a lame finish. -1 star. 12. Chris Benoit either won the vacant U.S. title or retained the title he was given earlier in the show, beating Jarrett in a ladder match in 10:15. Excellent match. Benoit suffered a big cut on the bridge of his nose early from getting the ladder dropkicked into his face and not protecting himself, which only made the thing more dramatic as he'd fire back with his face all bloody. Benoit delivered a superplex off the top. Jarrett did sort of a backwards superplex on Benoit from the ladder. Jarrett was hung upside down by his legs and the ladder was shoved down. Both took big bumps when the other would knock the ladder down. Benoit took a throat drop on the ropes, falling off the ladder while Jarrett crotched himself, taking a fall. Benoit climbed and Jarrett dropkicked the ladder and Benoit took a great bump. Benoit came back and delivered a diving headbutt off the top of the ladder, then climbed back up and grabbed the belt to win. 4 stars. 13. Bret Hart beat Bill Goldberg to retain the WCW title in 12:10. Goldberg dominated with power moves. Hart did a really good job of carrying Goldberg and making the match dramatic and believable before the flat finish took it down a notch. Way too many ref bumps, however. Billy Silverman was the first ref knocked down at 4 minutes. Charles Robinson was the second ref bumped when Goldberg suplexed Hart, whose legs knocked Robinson down. Goldberg missed the spear and hit the turnbuckle pads. Boone came back to ref. Hart used the figure 4 around the post and in doing the move appeared to crack his head on the floor. The trick to the move is that the guy who is taking the move has to grab the guy giving the move and hold him from crashing on the floor. Goldberg didn't hold on to Hart, who injured his back when he hit the floor hard doing the move. Hart continued to work on the legs before putting on the figure 4. Goldberg's forehead was bleeding pretty good by this point from him ramming it on a locker backstage, most likely. Good heat. Goldberg turned the figure 4 but Hart made the ropes. Boone got decked by Hart's backswing on a punch and Goldberg then side-kicked Hart and speared him. Roddy Piper came out with his arm in a brace. He deserves a ton of credit for working Thursday and Sunday with a freshly torn bicep even if he wasn't being asked to do much physically on either show. Hart put on the sharpshooter and Piper immediately called for the bell. Piper acted like he was a beaten man, like they threatened to eat his children or something, while Hart acted like he didn't know what was going on and the show abruptly went off the air. 2 3/4 stars. Vince Russo, sounding very desperate in the process, lashed out at criticism of his booking and blamed WCW standards and practices for the fact the ratings haven't improved since his arrival this past week on the WCW live show. Russo claimed that the ratings haven't fallen, actually they've yet to bottom out below the lowest rated Nitro in years in Kevin Nash's final week, but the December 13th Nitro drew the second lowest rating in years, which certainly can't be construed as showing improvement, and that everything to this point was to put things in place for the big angle at Starrcade and the next night with the recreation of the NWO. Russo blamed standards and practices for not allowing him to have Roddy Piper call Ronda Singh fat, no longer allowing Ed Ferrara to mimic Jim Ross Bell's palsy, and not allowing Buzzkill to burn incense on the air, none of which one way or the other meant even a blip when it comes to ratings. Russo said that WCW has to decide if it wants a squeaky clean show or ratings and that they can't have both. He said he was promised certain leeway when he came in and for the first 6 weeks everything was fine, but once the heat came from sponsors, the rules changed. He also said people in WCW have been trying to stab him in the back. There is far less feeling of Russo as a creative genius within the organization, and those who were 100% with him as recently as 4 weeks ago now privately believe he has no new ideas and just spun a good line. He claimed people in the company are saying the problem isn't standards and practices and that the show's writing hasn't been good, and claimed the people, who he never mentioned but are believed to be led by Kevin Sullivan and J.J. Dillon, were doing the same thing Jim Ross, Jim Cornette and Bruce Pritchard did to him in the WWF. He also lashed out at critics, myself in particular, with name-calling that made some in the organization think he was working an angle. Russo says he gauges his success by internet feedback and crowd response. You'd think he'd gauge success by quarter-hour ratings and most importantly, tickets being sold and pay-per-view by rates, but that would mean he'd have to write his shows for the general public and not the internet. He's apparently trying to build for a big angle on February 14th since Nitro will be unopposed with Raw airing at 11 p.m. due to the Westminster Dog Show. Among the ideas he talked about on the show were to bring Lenny Lane and Lodi back under the name Standards and Practices with crew cuts and glasses and playing nerdy characters. There he goes booking for the mainstream again. He also talked about bringing back Jim Hellwig as a full-timer, and also there was talk about talking with Bruno Sammartino. Nobody from WCW has at this point contacted Sammartino. which one would think would be to join the Zbyszko, Orndorff, Anderson, Piper team in a feud with Russo as the traditionalists who hate what Russo has done to wrestling. He talked about wanting to bring Randy Savage back but again said the contract situation is out of his hands, and talked about Jeff Jarrett as a main eventer starting early in the year. He also claimed if he left or was let go by WCW and he would never go back to the WWF because he could never work with Vince McMahon for another day. Keiji Muto was named Most Valuable Player in the 1999 Japanese Wrestling World in Media balloting conducted by Tokyo Sports. Out of the 22 pro wrestlers reports voting, Muto, who held the IWGP Heavyweight title most of the year, won in the runoff with Mitsuharu Misawa by a 14-8 vote. There had been some controversy regarding this award regarding the fact that foreign wrestlers are never considered due to Japanese traditions. Vader, who kept All Japan from falling even farther due to staleness and injuries to top talent, in particular Toshiaki Kawada missing most of the year, had been pushed by several foreigners as the first time a foreigner should have been able to rightfully be considered perhaps the strongest contender. As it turned out, even with the publicity regarding Vader as a strong candidate being made into an issue, he didn't even receive one vote. The initial voting saw Muto with 9 votes, Misawa with 6, Naoya Ogawa with 4, Genichiro Tenryu with 2 and Atsushi Onita with 1. This put Muto and Misawa in the runoff. Muto's IWGP title match with Tenryu on May 3rd in Fukuoka was voted Japanese Match of the Year. This was a close balloting which saw 2 runoff elections, finally beating the Misawa vs. Vader Tokyo Dome match held on May 2nd by a 12-10 margin. The original voting saw Muto vs. Tenryu get 4 votes, Misawa vs. Vader get 3, Kenta Kobashi vs. Vader January 15th in Yokohama with 3, the December 10th Osaka Muto vs. Tenryu IWGP title change with 3, Muto vs. Manabu Nakanishi IWGP finals with 2, the October 11th Tokyo Dome Ogawa vs. Shinya Hashimoto match with 2, the October 30th Budokan Hall Kobashi and Jun Akiyama vs. Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Omori with 2, and the Kobashi and Akiyama vs. Stan Hansen and Akira Taue Tag Team Tournament final on December 3rd in Budokan Hall, the Koji Kanemoto vs. Kendo Kashin Super Juniors Tournament final on June 8th. Japanese tradition is also never to vote a junior heavyweight match as match of the year, and even if that wasn't the case, this was a weak choice and it was well below expected standards, and the October 23rd Kobashi and Akiyama vs. Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa Tag Team title change with 1. The top 4 matches were put into a runoff, with Misawa vs. Vader and the May 3rd Muto vs. Tenryu getting 7 votes each, Kobashi vs. Vader getting 5 and the December 10th Muto vs. Tenryu again getting 3, putting the May 3rd Muto vs. Tenryu and Misawa vs. Vader into the finals. For Tag Team of the Year as expected, it was a one-sided election as Kobashi and Akiyama received 16 of 22 votes on the first balloting, with Nakanishi and Yuji Nagata getting 3, Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhito Takaiwa getting 2, which again goes against tradition of voting for junior heavyweights as award winners for the most prestigious awards, and Omori and Takayama with 1. In other awards, Kazushi Sakuraba of Dream Stage Entertainment parlayed his recent win over Royler Gracie to co-capture the Most Valuable Fighter award with Naoya Ogawa. Nakanishi won the Fighting Spirit award over Koto Fuyuki. Yuji Nagata was named Best Technical Wrestler for the second straight year with Jun Akiyama in second place. All Japan's Masamichi Marufuji won Rookie of the Year by a 14-7 margin over Magnum Tokyo as surprisingly Shima only got 2 votes. Lioness Asuka won Female Wrestler of the Year with 14 votes over second place Shinobu Kondori with 3. Shohei Babo is given a special Distinguished Service Prize, and other similar awards were presented to retiring wrestlers Masa Saito, Jumbo Tsuruta, Akira Maeda, Kazuo Yamazaki and New Japan referee Katsuhisa Shibata, along with awards given to deceased former wrestling stars Jackie Sato, Yoshino Sato, and Hiro Matsuda. They also gave awards to world champion female amateur wrestlers Kyoko Hamaguchi, Junko Shota, and Seiko Yamamoto. The E! Channel's True Hollywood Story program on December 19th focused on the career of Hulk Hogan, largely through the eyes of Terry Bollea. The story was kind of boring when compared with the recent A&E shows on wrestlers, but it wasn't nearly as inaccurate as one would expect given different versions of Hogan's career that have been passed around. The story focused on Bollea's childhood, his fascination from childhood with pro wrestling, claiming that he and friend Ed Leslie would attend the matches from a very young age, and delved into the early parts of his career rummaging through the Alabama and Memphis circuits, making no money and even quitting at one point before hitting the big time with the World Wrestling Federation. The story talked about Balia, as a huge kid, was a star baseball player but after breaking his arm, never played baseball again. In high school, he was more into playing guitar than sports despite his size, and was already into lifting weights. While he admitted steroid use during the show, his own use was really never gone into heavily, and he tried to say that all athletes at the time were using them, all being exaggerated, but certainly use was plentiful in any sport where size and speed were part of the equation. There were the exaggerations. Andre the Giant was still 7'4", but now grew to 550 to 700 pounds. Although there was a lot of talk beforehand that this would be the first piece on wrestling to focus on Japan since Antonio Inoki was interviewed, and since Hogan first made his name as a superstar in Japan before the United States, but Japan was barely mentioned. It was only briefly mentioned with a clip from Inoki talking about Hogan knocking him out in the first ever IWGP title match in 1983. Brad Rheingans talking about seeing Hogan wrestle in the Tokyo Dome and portraying it as if Hogan was a technical wrestling marvel when he worked Japan. Seriously, he really did intimate that, and Hogan telling a story about how Verne Gagne had him scheduled to win the AWA title from Nick Bockwinkel, but he turned the title down the night of the show because Gagne in return for the belt wanted a percentage of his Japanese deal in exchange for giving him the belt, and kind of used that as his reason for leaving Gagne with no notice and going to work for McMahon. Gagne claimed credit for teaching Hogan the ropes, with quotes from Gene Okerlund saying that when he arrived in the AWA in 1982 he was green both in and outside the ring, saying it often took 18 or 20 takes for him to do an interview at the beginning. Hogan was a star in the WWF by 1980 and a superstar in New Japan by about the same time after McMahon Sr. sent him to New Japan on his tour, before even coming to the AWA, and he claimed that Terry Funk was the one who put him in touch with Vince McMahon Sr., which also isn't true, but it was Funk who got him picked ahead of Gorilla Monsoon and John Studd among others for the Thunderlips role in Rocky III. But in his WWF days, Fred Blassie did virtually all the talking for him. Hogan himself credited both Verne and Greg Gagne for teaching him a lot when it came to working the crowd, but in the end said that Verne was an evil man. It also claimed that Vince McMahon Sr. fired him from the WWF for doing the Rocky movie, and the piece acted like he was fired from a job looking for work when he sent his resume to Gagne, forgetting that McMahon Sr. had made the New Japan connection for him and on a per-week basis in Japan, already making what was huge money at the time, and during his entire AWA tenure he was splitting time with New Japan, and that he had already made a huge name for himself in the industry in both Japan and WWF as a heel, before exploding as the biggest draw in the US in the AWA as a babyface. He also admitted that while the character Hulk Hogan may have been a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 as a role model, that the person playing the role was maybe a 3. They did air a great deal of footage of his wife talking about meeting him at first and their early courtship. It talked about his 9 years in the WWF when pro wrestling exploded for the first time on a national basis since the early 50s, when it was back on network television, including the Pontiac Silverdome match with Andre the Giant, creating the idea that nobody knew the finish of the Andre match until the afternoon of the show when Andre agreed to do the job. Sources close to the situation say the finish was agreed upon months beforehand. Hogan acted as if the body slam, which he claimed Andre had never allowed anyone to do before, in actuality, dating back to the late 70s. Hogan generally would slam Andre once for the big pop in all of their matches, and Andre by the 80s would let all of his larger opponents or wrestlers he respected, such as a Harley Race, Antonio Inoki, Ricky Choshu or Connect, slam him in singles matches, was a spot Andre called on the spur of the moment leading to the finish of their match. Hogan claimed that in executing the slam, he tore all these muscles in his arms and back because Andre weighed 600 pounds. In actuality, everyone that slammed Andre, if the match required the spot, did so without getting injured. They had some minor facts wrong in regard to his departure from the WWF, and pretty well ignored his role in the steroid scandal, and his appearance on Arsenio Hall was never brought up, and why it blew up as big as it did. The story claimed Hogan's last match in the WWF was in April 1992 at a WrestleMania in Las Vegas, when he showed up after an eye injury from a jet ski accident. In actuality, that WrestleMania was in 1993 and it wasn't his last match, and in fact, he won the WWF title on that very show. After the steroid scandal broke big in early 1992, after in the wake of the June 1991 trial of Dr. George T. Zaharian for selling steroids to numerous wrestlers in the WWF dressing rooms and through the mail, Hogan lied on Arsenio Hall, claiming he'd only used steroids 3 times in his life and only for injury rehabilitation, that he didn't know Zaharian at all. In fact, Zaharian actually not only regularly sold Hogan massive quantities of steroids but treated him for medical conditions as well, and both he and the WWF continued to try and tell that lie for months thereafter. Eventually, several of his colleagues came forward to dispute that notion and the whole thing exploded. McMahon and Hogan devised an angle to make him a sympathetic babyface when a lot of the public and media were turning on him, particularly the duality of his being a pitchman using his physique to sell vitamins for children when the physique was actually built on steroids. His vitamin company quickly went out of business at this point, by strongly hinting he'd retire at the WrestleMania in 1992, which actually was in Indianapolis. He took 1 year off to pursue his acting career before they planned the big comeback where he'd win the title back in 1993. He wrestled major shows for about 4 months and with WWF attendance at a low point, was drawing poorly and was asked to drop the title to Bret Hart. He chose to lose to Yokozuna instead and quit the promotion in August of 1993. The portrayal was that he had no intention of returning to wrestling and that Ted Turner in 1993 formed WCW, which was actually formed in 1988 when Turner bought out Jim Crockett, and Turner kept begging Hogan to come out of retirement. Actually, Hogan was working major shows in Japan the entire time, and was also working with Jimmy Hart and Hiro Matsuda on starting his own promotion with New Japan as the financial backers, and basically pulled out of the deal because Eric Bischoff made him an offer so lucrative he couldn't afford to turn it down and also didn't want to be bogged down with all the work of starting a new promotion. They talked about the trial, in which Hogan said he was expected to be the key witness in convicting McMahon, except that he testified that McMahon never sold him any steroids. The government in its indictment never alleged that McMahon had sold him steroids, only distributed steroids to him. Hogan was expected to be the key witness, and acted as if his testimony was the testimony that cleared McMahon, and McMahon's response was to after the trial label him a liar and a steroid abuse. Hogan's testimony helped McMahon for sure, but even if he had testified that McMahon distributed steroids to him, as McMahon's secretary at the time, Emily Feinberg, had testified, the charge still would have been thrown out at the trial because the government would have failed to prove that a crime took place in the Eastern District of New York. After McMahon was acquitted, Hogan said he never understood why McMahon in his first interview on the steps of the courthouse ripped on him for lying under oath. McMahon's actual statement was that Hogan didn't tell the complete truth, which I guess implied he lied, but he didn't use the word lie. And he felt personally betrayed by McMahon, who singled Hogan out for using steroids both then and later in Billionaire Ted's skits, but said he years later felt McMahon did so because he thought every story needed closure, and that was McMahon's idea of his closure of the Hogan story. They talked about him going to WCW and winning the title, but his act was getting old and Bischoff suggested the heel turn, which heated up his career for a few years, but it was a role that he personally didn't like playing. The special ended with the idea that Hogan had just turned backface, and didn't go into or try and sell his current angle at all. Whatever major curiosity that was supposed to come of a reprise of the Survivor Series finish and abrupt end of Starrcade for the ratings the next day didn't result, as it was the lowest rated day after a pay-per-view rating since Russo took over. Nitro on December 20th was more notable for the word shit being used in various forms and not bleeped out on 3 or 4 occasions during the show. WCW responded in a fashion remarkably like the WWF last week, with a press release stating, Monday evening some strong language aired live on WCW Monday Nitro. The reason for this occurrence was a network delay booth operator did not report to work on Monday evening. This absence was not immediately realized due to the fact that the broadcast operations center and the delay booth are located in different areas of the building. Once the personnel shortage was realized, the broadcast operations center took action to staff the delay booth. The network has taken corrective measures to prevent this type of incident from happening again in the future. There was no intent by WCW or the network to allow offensive language to air on the program. In particular, during the first hour of Nitro, during a Kevin Nash supposed shoot interview, complaining about the lack of pensions, medical, dental, and arduous schedule and physical punishment, Nash used the term shit and bullshit at about 8:35 p.m. Since the timing of this was on a show meant to be shocking, and meant to be the talk of wrestling the next day, there has to be suspicions. When this same interview aired at 1:35 a.m. that evening on the replay show, those words were all edited out. The reaction to the supposed mistake, which probably really was one if only because it made company co-owner Ted Turner look like such a hypocrite, although Bret Hart managed to say the same word as Nash on the air after the booth was definitely staffed about 30 minutes later in the show, was similar to a WWF's reaction of a different but similar situation a week earlier, which surely was an insincere claim of a planned incident as an accident. Last week Turner responded to a woman's question on Larry King Live regarding the direction wrestling had taken, had seen Turner claim the caller wasn't differentiating between the two products and blamed that on Vince McMahon's wrestling. The New York Post actually ran a story the day of Nitro regarding the direction of wrestling and Turner's comments and the swearing on the show on the very day the story ran completed an amazing coincidental trifecta of Vince Russo's booking plans, making Vince McMahon's enemies look like hypocrites. Despite its best laid-out show coming after its biggest angle in months, there was little in the way of good news from a ratings standpoint for WCW. Raw drew a 5.83 rating, 5.55 first hour, 6.09 seconds hour, and an 8.8 share to Nitro's 3.20 rating, 3.89 first hour, 2.86 seconds hour, 2.89 third hour, and a 4.9 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 6 minutes, it was Raw at 5.83 to Nitro's 2.74, making the total wrestling audience for the night at about 9.9 million. The reason Nitro's head-to-head average is below the rating of both its second and third hours is because the third hour average included a 5-minute period which went unopposed. If you take the unopposed 5 minutes, that third hour average drops all the way from 2.89 to 2.70. Monday Night Football, Green Bay Packers vs. Minnesota Vikings, drew a 15.12 rating. The main event comparisons on paper are totally misleading because of Nitro going so much longer. On paper it looks like Kane vs. Big Show grew from a 5.64 final quarter to a 6.08 overrun, which isn't misleading, while WCW grew from a 2.91 for Bagwell and Piper's interview to a 3.59 for the Goldberg vs. Hart title match with the NWO angle, which is very misleading. However, because most of those ratings points were garnered unopposed by going longer, which was a smart move because the climax of the angle did air after Raw went off the air and before the largest possible audience. Actually, even with all the hype, the Goldberg vs. Hart segment that went opposed to Kane vs. Show dropped into the mid-twos, which is inexplicable considering such a strong job had been done of building anticipation for that match. I actually thought they'd close the gap for the main event down to less than 1.5 ratings points, and it was really more than 3 points difference. Raw doubled Nitro in 5 of the 8 head-to-head quarters. Where Nitro did well against Raw was in holding its first hour audience for a few extra minutes, with Piper doing a hell of an interview and being confronted by both Goldberg and Hart proclaiming his innocence of wrongdoing, which saw the drop from a 4.0 to 3.4, less than half the usual drop when Raw starts, which led to Raw opening at just a 4.7, one of its lowest quarters in months, for the Test vs. Outlaws match. The rout was on starting the next quarter as Raw grew to 5.66 for Edge and Matt Hardy vs. Christian and Jeff Hardy, while Nitro fell to 2.50 for Maestro vs. Courageous. The biggest gap in the show came next, with Raw up to 6.35 for the Angle, where Triple H and Stephanie berated Jim Ross in the Angle vs. Viscera match, and you know it wasn't Viscera that drew that rating, while Nitro fell to 2.33 for the Page vs. Canyon vs. Bigelow match. Nash and Hall vs. Creative Control grew the Nitro audience to 2.89, while the Dudleys vs. Acolytes vs. Moolah and Mae Young saw Raw drop all the way to 5.46. The peak rating for the night was the topless top rope match, teasing either Terry or BB exposing their breasts, ending with BB taking off her bra but Triple H playing heel and putting his jacket to cover her up and then selling them for all he was worth for some time in the future when people will pay big money to see them. And it did work, doing a 6.45 rating to 2.54 for Nitro, with Chuck Zito returning as Mr. Marinara, leading to Disco Inferno's heel turn and the Varsity Club vs. Harlem Heat. Other weekend ratings for December 18th to 19th saw Livewire at 1.6, Superstars at 1.5 and Sunday Night Heat at 3.37. WCW Saturday Night fell to a 1.5, and even though the rating dropped from the previous week, in comparison to the rest of the station that day it did a lot better. It was the second highest rated show on the station. For December 16th, WWF SmackDown did a 4.41 rating to Thunder's 2.33. The total audience watching wrestling was about 9.4 million. Thunder ranged from a low of 1.8 for Courageous vs. Prince Iaukea to a high of 2.5 for the cage match. ECW on December 17th drew a 1.04 rating and a 1.8 share, with again the audience growing in every quarter, while Roller Jam did in 0.6 rating and 1.0 share. Mexico. Because of Christmas Eve, the traditional major Friday night show in Mexico City for EMLL is being moved to Saturday at Arena Coliseo, headlined by Tarzan Boy vs. Rey Bucanero. On the weekend television in Tijuana, they had 2 different shows advertised for Christmas Day. Not sure which is taking place, if not both. One ad listed a 5:30 p.m. show headlined by Super Astro and Villano Tricero vs. Fishman and Lismark Sr. in a match where the losing team would have to wrestle each other in a singles match and that loser would unmask, which would be a real big deal since all these guys have had their masks seemingly forever, more than 25 years for all except Astro, and he's had his since at least the early 80s, plus a Rey Mysterio Sr. vs. Psicosis singles match. Fishman was to lose his mask earlier this year in Juarez but no-showed the card, so he's been talking of losing it for a few years and has never done it. OUTTRO is also a possibility. A show advertised for an 8:30 p.m. start had the same Mysterio vs. Psychosis match but also a Super Parka vs. Halloween Mask vs. Mask match, but now we're told that show was moved up to December 23rd. The December 17th show in Mexico City at Arena Coliseo had the annual Grand Alternative Tournament before about 3,000 fans. This is where they have an established star team with a prelim wrestler, and the prelim wrestler on the winning team is always elevated to stardom the next year. They've done this tournament the past 6 years, and the prelim wrestler on the winning teams have been Hector Garza, shocker, Mascara Magica, the only one who really didn't catch on as a new star, Rey Bucanero, Olympico, and Ultimo Guerrero. This year's finals came down to Felino and Tigre Blanco beating Scorpio Jr. and Fugaz, when Blanco, who if history is any indicator, will be promoted big time next year, then Scorpio Jr. after a senton off the top. The newspapers were highly praising prelim wrestlers Sombra de Plata, La Flecha, and Ricky Marvin, saying it was the second best of the 6 tournaments. The first one, which elevated Garza to stardom when he clean pinned El Satanico, is generally considered the best. Antonio Pena said that he still wanted to do the 6-sided cage match, which was scheduled for December 10th but later cancelled in March, but also talked about doing a match in 2000 in water. The IWRG held a major show on December 16th in Naucalpan before 1,000 fans as the 37th anniversary of the Moreno family promoting wrestling in that city, billed as Caravan of Champions. For the vacant IWRG heavyweight title, Scorpio Jr. beat Super Parka to win the title. The last champ was Pirata Morgan, who vacated the title when he jumped to AAA. They also had a trios title match with Maniac Cop, Invader Cop, and Cyborg Cop over Olympico and Tony Rivera and Mascara Magica, and a middleweight title change with Ultimo Vampiro, who already holds the welterweight title, beating Bombero Infernal. Scorpio Sr. announced he was be having a retirement match on December 23rd in Naucalpan, which will be his team with Shocker and Shu El Guerrero against Santo and Negro Casas and Mr. Niebla. AAA held its annual awards banquet on December 14th in Mexico City. They split the awards into Rudo and Technico awards. For Wrestler of the Year, the Rudo was Cibernetico and the Technico was Octagon. For Woman Wrestler of the Year, the Rudo was Miss Janeth and Technico was Esther Moreno. For Mini of the Year, the Rudo was Mini Abismo Negro and the Technico was Octagonchito. For Rookie of the Year, the Rudo was Espiritu and Technico was Pathfinder, who is said to be a great flyer. For Rising Star of the Year, the Rudo was Gran Apache 1 and Technico was Oscar Sevilla. For Women's Rising Star, the Rudo was Tiffany and Technico was Fabi Apache. For Tag Team of the Year, Rudo were the Headhunters and Technicos were Panther and Hater. For Female Tag Team, the Rudos were Janeth and Xochitl Hamada and Technicos were Alda and Cynthia Moreno. For Trio of the Year, the Rudos were Cobarde and Texano and Sangre Chicana and Technicos were Pero Ogueyo and Pero Ogueyo Jr. and Latin Lover. For Women Trios, the Rudos were Janeth and Hamada and Rossi Moreno and Technicos were Alda and Cynthia and Esther Moreno. And for Atomicosh, 4-man Team of the Year, the Rudos were Los Vados Locos and Technicos were Los Payasos. Tropicasas was named Ref of the Year. There was a benefit show in which all the proceeds, which turned out to be $1,100 US, which doesn't sound like much but in Mexico it's a significant figure, went to the family of Aaron Alvarado Nieves, who recently died from pancreatitis on December 15th, in Tlalnepantla. Some of the top names like Elio del Santo, Felino, Fuerza Guerrera, Blue Panther and Emilio Charles Jr. worked the show along with 2 brothers, Brazo de Oro and Brazo de Plata. 2 of his other brothers actually were no-shows. The Black Warrior vs. Olympico NWA Light Heavyweight title match, which has been pushed for more than a month, took place before 4,500 fans on December 14th at Arena Coliseo, ending as a double countout with Olympico diving in right at 20 to make it look like he'd beaten the count and won the title, only for it to be ruled he'd just missed. All Japan. The February 17th Triple Crown title match in Sapporo looks to have Vader, provided he gets by Jun Akiyama on January 23rd in Yokohama, which is the likely result, defending against the winner of the Kena Kobashi vs. Toshiaki Kawada match, which takes place on January 17th in Osaka. Mitsuharu Misawa on a recent TV show said he was considering next April's Champion Carnival tournament to change from the round-robin format to a traditional single-elimination tournament. His explanation is that would give every wrestler in the company, including the prelim wrestlers, a chance to be in the tournament. The one loss and you're out format will also remove a lot of the luster in what makes the tournament so interesting, but also be far less of a booking nightmare to put together in a sport where injuries are so plentiful and one injury screws up all the plans. New Japan. Tatsumi Fujinami had a meeting with Nobuhiko Takada on December 15. Not sure what kind of an angle they are working on yet, but most likely one to bring Takada back to New Japan. The company ran a benefit show on December 18 in Tokyo Meki Akishima before 2,500 fans with a typical lineup which did include Keiji Muto but not Masahiro Chono. Antonio Inoki, Shinya Hashimoto and rookie Kenzo Suzuki were at the show. Hashimoto was in the ring doing a workout with Takashi Iizuka, Suzuki and Katsuyoshi Shibata demonstrating how hard he's kicking and doing Naoya Ogawa's own STO takedown. Hashimoto has apparently dropped even more weight, down to about 250. They seem to be building toward a Koji Kanemoto vs Fujinami feud in the junior heavyweight division for next year. Other Japan notes. There have been a few changes in the rings tournament on December 22. Pat Miletic is officially out and will be replaced by David Mena, who is a very tough 170-pound guy, in a first-round match against Kiyoshi Tamura. They also pulled out the Fulton vs Joe Slick match, claiming a leg injury to Han. That match has been replaced by Maurice Smith vs Brandon Lee Hinkle, a national-caliber amateur wrestler. The Smith-Hinkle winner would then face the Henzo Gracie Wataru Sakata winner in the second round, which also takes place that night. The fact Han was pulled out gives credence to the idea this tournament will be a complete shoot, just as the first tournament was. The idea they had a fighter with the name power of Smith to replace Han also says that more likely than not, the leg injury was a cover story to get Han out. Tsuyoshi Kosaka returned to Japan on December 18 for the show, still suffering from the eye injury from the UFC match against Pedro Hitso. At Michinoku's final show of the year on December 21 at Korakuen Hall, Great Sasuke made an announcement that his company is looking to put on the third Super J Cup in April 2000, with the idea of it being a 16-man single elimination tournament over 2 or 3 nights, ending at Tokyo Sumo Hall. Sasuke wanted the tournament to include wrestlers from both All Japan and New Japan. There have been 2 previous Super J Cups, the first in April 1994 won by Chris Benoit. This was actually the show that made Sasuke into a major star when he had 3 Match of the Year candidates on the same night, beating El Samurai and Jushin Liger before losing to Benoit in the finals. And the second in December 1995 won by Liger, which indirectly is the show that got Chris Jericho his job with WCW. WCW saw a tape of the show and noticed his match with Benoit, and Bischoff wanted to sign him. They were 2 of the best wrestling shows of the decade. Sasuke said that Ultimo Dragon would be the commissioner of the J-Cup and announced that himself, Minoru Fujita, Tiger Mask, Sasuke the Great, Masaaki Mochizuki and Magnum Tokyo would all be in it. Mitsuharu Misawa was then asked on December 22 about helping a Super J-Cup and said that his company's top junior heavyweight, Yoshinari Ogawa, was a top star in the company, so it would be difficult to put him in such a tournament. Translated, he's pushed so hard that unless they let him win, they don't want him jobbing for 170-pound guys. At the house show it was Sasuke Mania as one trio of 3 Sasukes, Great Sasuke and 2 other guys wearing Sasuke masks, beat Sasuke the Great and Masked Tiger 2 and Fake Naniwa in the main event. Neo Ladies has a press conference scheduled for December 25. It is expected that it will be the announcement that the company will fold after the January 6 Korakuen Hall show, as Kyoko Inoue, who runs the company, is already appearing to be online to make a move to FMW next year. Wrestlers from All Japan, New Japan, Pancrase and DSC shared the same stage on December 21 at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym for an amateur wrestling benefit. The Amateur Wrestling Federation used pro wrestling as a fundraiser, drawing about 1,500 fans, announced as 2,450. Anil Hamaguchi, whose daughter Kyoko is a 3-time world champion in amateur, was there, and one of the amateur wrestlers who is national ranking in Japan right now is the younger brother of Yuji Nagata. The Amateur Federation only wanted wrestlers with strong amateur backgrounds on the show, so it ended up with Yuji Nagata, a former national champion 1992 Olympic hopeful, going to a draw with Manabu Nakanishi, a former national champion who went to the 1992 Olympics, Masa Fuchi, considered a good shooter in his day, and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi, a good high school wrestler, beating Masamichi Marufuji, a high school national champion, and Tamon Honda, 3-time Olympic Games super heavyweight. Shinjiro Otani, a very good high school wrestler, went to a draw with Kendo Kashin, a former national champion who was a 1992 Olympic Games prospect, Ishiki Takahashi, A former top college wrestler Drew K. Yamamiya in a 3 minutes pancrase rules exhibition match. Yoshiaki Yatsu, a two-time national champion at 1980 Olympian who is the only pro wrestler that I've ever heard of who was a top star in pro, who went back to amateur wrestling in 1987 and won a national championship, but because he was considered a pro athlete, the IOC refused to allow him to compete in the 1988 Olympics, and Masahiko Kochi beat Alexander Otsuka and Mach Junji, and the main event saw Kazushi Sakuraba do a pro wrestling exhibition beating Daijiro Matsui with a heel hook in 4:53. Sakuraba, in his first match since the Henzo Gracie match, made no bones about what he was doing as he threw in a lot of pro wrestling maneuvers. War ran its year-end show at Korakuen Hall on December 16, headlined by Genichiro Tenryu and Atsushi Onita and Magnum Tokyo, forming a babyface trio for the first time ever, beating Nobutaka Araya and Shoji Nakamaki and Yoshikazu Taro in 1832 when Tenryu pinned Araya using Kensuke Sasaki's, his opponent on the January 4 New Japan Tokyo Dome show, Northern Lights bomb finisher. Onita challenged Tenryu to an IWGP title match, and then Onita, before the crowd ripped up a Riki Choshu t-shirt, Onita said he would be going to the Tokyo Dome to hear 60,000 fans cheer that they won an Onita vs. Choshu match, which appears now to be scheduled for April. Tenryu said that if he beats Sasaki, he'll give Onita a shot. Also on the show, Masaaki Mochizuki retained the company's international junior title, beating Toriuman's Yoshiyuki Saito. They continued the Koto Fuyuki ECW Japan angle at a pair of press conferences. Fuyuki came back from the US and held a press conference on December 16 saying that he had reached a working agreement with Paul Heyman, that he would be forming ECW Japan, billed as a rival promotion but actually an NWO-type gimmick, and bring in ECW wrestlers. The next day, FMW held a press conference and said that they already had a talent exchange agreement with ECW and with Heyman, and that Fuyuki was a liar. Fuyuki then showed up at the press conference and attacked woman wrestler Kyoko Inoue to set up a December 25 singles match between the two. During the altercation, H tried to save Inoue but ended up hitting her when Fuyuki moved. Masato Tanaka, who is doing an angle that he's against FMW and with ECW because of how FMW has pushed guys ahead of him, will defending his WU title on FMW's first show of the new year on January 5 at Korakuen Hall against former tag partner Tetsuhiro Kuroda. There will also be an 8-man with H and Mr. Ganasuke and Hiskatsu Oya and Riki Fuji against a 4-man team from ECW. All Japan Women announced its first 2 years of 2000 for Korakuen Hall on January 3 and January 4. The January 3 show will have Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Makawa defend the WWWA Tag Team titles against the currently ongoing Tag Team Tournament winners. The January 4 show is headlined by Yumiko Hata vs. Manami Toyota for the WWWA title. Ayako Seiki, the 230-pound woman wrestler who debuted last week to a lot of publicity, was injured in training and spent 2 days last week in the hospital and won't return until the new year. Curry man Christopher Daniels won the British Commonwealth Junior title from Minoru Fujita on the December 14 Michinoku Pro Show in Niigata. Big Japan opens January 2 at Korakuen Hall with Kamikaze and Shunmei Matsuzaki defending the tag titles against Winger and Shadow WX, and Ryuji Yamakawa defending the deathmatch title against Tomoaki Honma. They are also having a singles tournament from January 2 to January 10 called Big Japan Grand Prix 2000 with first round matches of Yamakawa vs. Honma. The title match is actually a tournament first round match. Daikokubo Benkei vs. Mike Samples, Jun Kasai vs. Grand Sheik, Ari Romero, and Winger vs. WX. The CMLL Japan Tour from February 5 to February 13, which will be Mil Mascara's next to last tour in Japan, has Mascaras, Dos Caras, Apollo Dantes, Tarzan Boy, Ricky Marvin, Fantasma, Tigre Blanco, Starman Shinobi, Rey Bucanero, Ultimo Guerrero, Violencia, Sangre Azteca, Super Cacao and Enigma brought up, plus women wrestlers La Diabolica and Chikako Shiratori and Alexander Otsuka, and Ikuto Hidaka, who is currently in ECW. Shaprita Asari, who has been working for lots of indie promotions doing undercard matches, has officially quit the Neo Ladies group to become an indie wrestler, saying she'll wrestle next year in Michinoku Pro, AJW and Urgent. Urgent held a one-night Twin Stars of Urgent tag team tournament won by Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda, beating Michiko Omukai and Yumi Fukawa on December 19 in Kyoto. IWA Japan ran its final show of the year on December 14 at Korakuen Hall, doing a Survivor-style elimination tournament with IWA against Now. It came down to Yoshia Yamashita and Katsutoshi Niyama of IWA against Tarzan Goto and Freddy Krueger. Doug Gilbert of Now. Actually, most of the Now wrestlers were IWA wrestlers, but they used Now members Kendo Nagasaki and Yuichi Taniguchi to give it credibility. IWA owner Kiyoshi Asano, The latest of the owners who have decided they can wrestle, body slammed Kruger and used a flying body press off the top rope on him, which led to him being pinned here and there. The long-awaited 2020 piece on training to become a pro wrestler aired on December 16th. It was really good as well as being pretty accurate, which is something of a rarity for mainstream media pieces. It focused largely on Leigh Thatcher's training school in Cincinnati and the power plant. The piece was accurate in that they noted pro wrestling was choreographed with predetermined endings, but also showed just how hard it is to train to become a top pro wrestler. They showed one sequence of two trainees in the ring while Thatcher was at ringside calling one high spot after another for them to do. Thatcher's students that aren't even full-time pros are more solid in the ring than a lot of the wrestlers in the Big Three. The main people in the piece were Dean Roll, or Shark Boy, who Thatcher actually trained before going to the power plant, and since the piece was filmed, Roll was let go by WCW, Nigel McGuinness, who came all the way from England to train with Thatcher, who displayed a world-class attitude and enthusiasm but was undersized, and Craig Zellner, a former New Mexico football player at 6'1", 255, who can do backflips and land on his feet and who is Thatcher's current top student and who he used as an example of someone who is going to make it. They showed both men cutting interviews. McGuinness was better than many current pros already, and wrestling on small-time show. On that show, Thatcher said maybe 10% of his students would make it, but later on Wrestling Observer Live said he didn't know why he said that number because the real figure would be significantly lower. They also showed guys in the power plant doing calisthenics to death and interviewed Paul Orndorff. A 1-hour court TV documentary on the current state of pro wrestling is scheduled now for March. Pretty simple. December 18th, Power Pro Wrestling show in Memphis, continuing the Rico Constantino push, showing him winning a squash and visiting a children's hospital in Louisville. Jason Lee, who is white, and Derek King, who is black, are now wrestling as a tag team called the Atomic Blondes, managed by C.B. Wyatt, with King bleaching his hair. They're billing them as cousins, and Wyatt holds a mirror for them to stare at themselves before the matches. Rock did an interview on the show plugging that he'd be in Memphis on December 30th for the WWF house show. Like in Ohio Valley, Flash Flanagan is now going simply under the name Flash. On TV, he wrestled Trailer Park Trash, and Dave Brown on commentary went into the history of their OVW feud. Finish saw Trash on the top rope and Steve Bradley interfered, shoving him off, throw a table to the floor, and he was counted out. TV main was Ali versus Steve Bradley, which ended when Jim Cornette tried to throw fire at Brandon Baxter, but it just grazed him. Baxter, to his credit, didn't oversell it. The show was said to have heavily stressed athleticism. Tony Atlas and One Man Gang will be working WWC when it starts its new year off on January 6th in Caguas. Gang will be headlining in Universal title matches against Carlos Colon, while Atlas and El Nene face tag champs Victor the Bodyguard and Bouncer Bruno. The WWC End of Century Tour was only so-so for business. The December 16th show in Montevideo drew about 1,500. The December 18th show in Guaynabo drew 1,800. The outsiders brought in for the tour were Big Japan wrestlers Mike Samples, Shadow WX, Ryuji Yamakawa and Tomoaki Honma, along with One Man Gang, Jim Steele, All Japan's Wolf Hockfield, and Kendall Windham. Abdullah the Butcher, who booked the Big Japan guys in for the tour, no-showed the weekend, so the Japanese didn't end up getting paid before they left the island. The only title change we're aware of is Chicky Star beating Shane for the TV title in Guaynabo. The WXO promotion headed by Howard Lipkin, using a lot of the wrestlers that WCW let go, Eric Watts, Chad Fortune types, and with Dan Severn, that taped in Lakeland, Florida last month, is scheduled to start in syndication in mid-January. Angelo Abate, 85, who wrestled as the Italian Bulldog, passed away this past week in Florida from leukemia. A correction from the December 12th issue when talking about the CWA in Bremen, Germany. Black Navy SEAL isn't Eddie Jackie, it's former Leroy Howard. Both are from Florida and have worked WCW jobs in years past on syndicated and Saturday night TV. Howard has also worked in Japan, Battlers, in recent months, in Puerto Rico for IWA this past week as Rasta Man. John Tenta returned home from his tour of England due to his wife being hospitalized in Canada. He's expected to return in February or March. Congratulations to Dan and Wendy. Not to mention Merry Christmas to everyone around the world reading this. Independent Wrestling Federation on January 22nd in South Plainfield, New Jersey at Grand Slam USA. Midwest Renegade Wrestling on January 14th in St. Louis at Overland Community Center. January 15th in Cape Girardeau, Missouri at the National Guard Armory, both headlined by Bullpain vs. Tracy Smothers. Jebediah and Trailer Park Trash won the OVW tag titles from Rip Rogers and Jason Lee on December 15 in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Stampede Wrestling has been building up to a British Bulldog vs. Richard Pound cage match stemming from an angle where Bulldog did a run-in a few weeks ago, which will take place sometime in January in Calgary. Former WCW valet Chastity showed up for Extreme Pro Wrestling in Southern California over the weekend to feud with Missy Hyatt, but by the end of the weekend Hyatt wasn't working for the company after a backstage argument. Nicole Bass, believe it or not, Bass was mad at her for wearing the same white shirt and jeans clothes. Bass' sexual harassment lawsuit against the WWF goes for its first court date on January 7. She's also releasing a series of sexual dominating videos. There's some irony to all that. MMA. In the California State Athletic Commission's approval of MMA, a major compromise given is that matches in California will not allow closed fist striking on the ground. There should be quite a few promoters running shows with the new regulations basically legalizing MMA in the state, which is actually a pretty huge positive movement. Pancrase ran its year-end pay-per-view show on December 18 at Yokohama Bunka Gym before 3,800 fans. It was announced as a sellout 5,500, which in this day and age was considered a good showing. Minoru Suzuki was brought back for the main event in his hometown for his first match in 1 year and proved to still have drawing power to the casual fan who popped biggest for Suzuki's name and an interview reference by Yoshiki Takahashi to Dynamite Kid. He's still basically shot, and he was knocked out on the ground by an open-handed blow, and opponent Sanae Kikuta face-locked him, and the ref stopped the one-sided match in just 2:39. Chuck Liddell of UFC fame pulled out of the show in the final week due to the flu, which we're told is legit, so kickboxer John Crunk, who was said to have had a 59-5 record and hold several titles, met Yoshiki Takahashi in their Pancratian rules, similar to MMA, Shudo and UFC, with no low blows, biting, attacking the eyes, pulling hair, attacking the spine, or holding onto the ropes. Takahashi announced before the match that he was going to honor the Dynamite Kid by using a diving headbutt during this match, which one would think would be a total impossibility, but that's the new trend among shoot fighters to make statements like that to show that shoot fighting is part of pro wrestling to draw from the wrestling audience. Takahashi mounted him and punched his face, headbutted him many times, and started elbowing his face before Kronk tapped in 7:59. The Japanese were impressed that a kickboxer with no ground background, although he has clearly trained for the ground, was able to last 8 minutes with Takahashi. Kyuma Kunyoku beat Lane Andrews of Indiana in 14:44 with an armbar with 16 seconds left. Kunyoku pounded on him from the mount, and when he heard the 30 seconds call, went for a finisher in a match he dominated. They did a 3-minute exhibition with Masakatsu Funaki and Asami Shibuya, basically to show the newly blonde-headed Funaki in fighting shape without putting him in a serious fight, since Funaki most likely won't fight until the May 26th date with Hicks and Gracie. In the other Pancratian rules matches, Kuiza Minowa drew Chris Lytle, although Minowa would have won the decision but couldn't put him away. Lytle has been training in the submissions of late in Japan. Genki Sudo, the charismatic Boss Rudin protege, beat Nathan Marquardt with an armbar in 14:36, or again just 24 seconds before the match was to end. Sudo, who did an old New Japan-style Big Van Vader ring entrance, was actually on the bottom much of the way. The next show is January 23 at Korakuen Hall, headlined by Yuki Kondo vs. Manabu Yamada. The Full Contact Fighter television show that at one point was proposed as being a regular series on TSN is on hold due to the political climate. The pilot episode that aired in September, focusing on the Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz fight, was the most watched news magazine type show in the 15-year history of TSN, drawing numbers basically equivalent to the popular off-the-record episodes with the likes of Mick Foley, with all the retirement hype going in, Steve Austin, Vince McMahon, and Bret Hart, which are the most popular episodes in that show's history. However, due to the attempted buyout of TSN by Sports.net and CTV having to be approved, TSN isn't looking at adding any programming that might be seen controversial because it might hold up the merger. This is pretty much the same issue as to why WWF afternoon programming was dropped. The first K1 of 2000 will be January 25 in Nagasaki, with Peter Aerts vs. Musashi and Rob Hayashi vs. Amada. ECW. Masato Tanaka beating Mike Awesome for the ECW title headlined the December 17 TV tapings in Nashville before 2,500 fans in a match that airs on the Christmas Eve TNN show. The angle started with Tanaka at ringside, similar to how Awesome was the night he won the title. Awesome threw Spike Dudley into the crowd and wound up doing a pull-apart with Tanaka, with both Cyrus and Paul Heyman involved. They already acknowledged Tanaka was in the US for a December 23 title match in White Plains, New York against Awesome, which would explain him at ringside scouting. Cyrus convinced Heyman to let Tanaka get the title match on this show. They had what was described as another fantastic match, including doing two real noteworthy spots, a tornado DDT off the apron through a table and a running Awesome bomb on the apron, dropping Tanaka through a table. After Tanaka won the match, Awesome offered to shake his hand, like Taz did when Awesome won the title, but Awesome then attacked Tanaka and power-bombed him through another table. The White Plains show sold out 3,500 seats a few days in advance, and plans were to make it the most loaded card of the year, with all the top guys facing their best opponents underneath, plus Dreamer versus Credible ladder match and the title match. When Tanaka returns in January, he and Awesome will do another 2-month program over the ECW title. Chris Candido, Tammy Sytch and Axel Rotten were all officially fired this past week. The dressing room last week in Dover, Delaware was said to be totally unprofessional to the point of embarrassment. Heyman wasn't at the show, but it was clear some examples were going to have to be made. And since Candido, Sytch and Rotten were all on the bubble, there was little choice. Heyman had privately said when Sytch came back that he expected it would be a short-term thing, and from the booking you can see he, after her second week back, used her to jumpstart his TV ratings and then tried to transfer her star power to the other women in the promotion rather than focusing it on her. Others say that while Heyman needed to get rid of them, there were wrestlers in even worse shape higher on the card that he's keeping. It was clear even to a TV viewer that Sytch and Rotten, although it was not noticeable watching regarding Candido, had become shells of what they once were. For better or for worse, Heyman right now is the only owner in the company who is seemingly addressing these issues at all and has gotten rid of and suspended people. Also in Nashville, in a match with Raven and Dreamer defending against DeVito and Angel, which also airs this week on TNN, they started with a staged fight with the Baldies against some fans, with Dreamer, as would be his role if it wasn't staged, trying to calm down the situation. While Dreamer was occupied, this allowed all the Baldies to attack Raven and crucify him on the TNN set, reprising the crucifixion angle that ECW actually did before everyone else copied it. They did an angle to explain the departure of Rotten. Rotten and Balls Mahoney were scheduled against Corino and Victory. It was announced that Rotten and Mahoney had both been destroyed backstage. Mahoney came out all bloody with the idea that Rotten was hurt even worse. Sandman ended up getting involved to help Mahoney when he was getting double-teamed. This brought out Rhino, who speared Sandman through 2 tables, at which point Mahoney used a chair shot on Corino for the pin. New Jack didn't work the tour since they were in Tennessee, and he has an outstanding warrant in that state. Justin Credible missed the final night of the tour due to a death in the family. Super Crazy and Ikuto Hidaka also had what was described as a 4 stars match that airs on TNN, with Hidaka doing that swinging DDT springboarding off the ropes. It was also said that the During and Roadkill vs. Kid Cash and Nova vs. the Dupes 3-way dance was among the best tag team 3-way dances of the year, and that overall this was one of the best ECW shows of 1999. Mikey Whipwreck suffered a broken thumb in a match with Rob Van Dam in Nashville. Tanaka has one of his front teeth knocked out the next night in Chattanooga in his first title defense against Kentaro Kanemura, who he also worked with at the other house show of the week in Cookeville, Tennessee on December 16, who was said to have looked okay, basically working what was described as the typical Tracy Smothers match in his Nashville appearance. There's nothing new regarding Dusty Rhodes. The original idea was for him to work Nashville and White Plains, but there are no definitive plans because, among other things, Terry Funk hasn't committed to work an angle with him yet. TNN show on December 17 was below the recent standards. This was taped in Richmond, Virginia on December 10. They had Nova and Kid Cash and Chris Chetty do an interview. Chetty wanted to return, but Nova brought up guys whose careers ended early with back injuries like Dynamite Kid, Shawn Michaels and Ricky Steamboat, and said he'd team with Cash. Chetty walked away but then accused Cash of checking out his ass, but didn't get them mad, claiming his face was so pretty it would turn a straight man gay. New Jack pinned Tony DeVito in 2 minutes after a chair to the head off the top rope. New Jack pulled out a fork and was about to use it when Grimes and Angel jumped him. Joel Gertner then said, "Oh my God, he's going to fork DeVito." Angel stapled New Jack's ear and the Baldies issued an open challenge to anyone in the back. Awesome came out to wrestle Grimes. Grimes took a running bump on the floor where he kicked up his heels and landed on the back of his head. The psychosis bump into the corner, but done on the floor. The punches and forearms were brutal, as in terrible brutal, not stiff brutal. Match ended with a really clumsy, because of Grimes' weight, power bomb off the apron through a table that was totally mistimed in 3:20. If these two wrestled regularly, either they'd have to learn to get their moves to look better or they'll literally kill each other in the process. They did a Danny during interview in the showers, which was mainly an excuse to show Francine and Elektra in a towel. Ikuto Hidaka vs Supercolo vs Tom Marquez went 3-17 before Sabu and Fonzie showed up to attack everyone. TV main was to determine the top contenders for the tag titles, with Storm and Credible beating Rhino and Condito in 7:05. Rhino's offense continues to look great. Fast-paced, decent match. After the cat fight spot, Rhino accidentally speared Condito and Storm pinned Condito with a super kick. Rhino was mad at Condito. Sandman was in the crowd hanging out, getting a great reaction, and hit the ring. Jason then told Storm and Credible to leave, so he could be alone for Sandman to kill him with a cane. Credible then hit Sandman with some cane shots. Sandman ducked and Credible hit Storm with a cane, and Sandman did the leg sweep, using the cane on Credible. Rhino came back out and speared Sandman through a table. Raven never ran in but kept telling Tommy, who ended up being Francine, that he was trying to do the right thing and was too weak to turn on Dreamer again, which I guess means that he's going to shortly. At the house shows this past weekend and at the January 7th show in Atlanta, they announced that anyone with a ticket stub for the show can get free tickets to the January 9th pay-per-view in Birmingham, which tells you all you need to know about how ticket sales for that show are doing. WCW. Bill Goldberg was injured from glass cuts doing an angle to end the Thunder show on December 21st, and at press time was in a Salisbury, MD hospital, and there were no details regarding how seriously he was injured other than he had full feeling in his fingers and hands, which was considered a good sign since the tremendous blood loss reminded a lot of people of the David Finlay leg injury. This was not an angle even though it came during an angle. The show-long storyline was that Goldberg was going to take out every member of the NWO one by one. He finally got to Russo in a white limo in the parking lot as the show ended, and was, while wearing his shoot-fighter gloves, punching out one window after another. The flying glass apparently cut deeply into his tricep, and there was a massive amount of blood flowing and towels drenched in Goldberg's blood before he was taken away. Regarding Bruno Sammartino appearing here, while no deal had been done and at press time nobody from WCW had even contacted him, apparently he's more than open to listening. Maybe a month back, someone went to him as an intermediary and asked if he'd be interested, and he talked about it positively. Ed Ferrara a week or so back went to Larry Zbyszko with the idea of using Sammartino, who is now 64 and has been an outspoken critic of pro wrestling, and the turn it has taken since he left the WWF in 1987, although he has made a few refereeing appearances for WCW and done announcing and public appearances for many indie groups. Sammartino was contacted by longtime friend Chris Cruz about the idea and was interested, apparently saying he'd do it if the money was right and the angle was right and if he wasn't portrayed in a negative light, but wanted it to be in a 6-man or 8-man tag and preferably a cage match so he wouldn't have to take bumps. Sammartino would most likely join the Legends team against the NWO or a mid-level team put together by Russo in the storyline, at least that's how it would appear to make sense. Sammartino hasn't wrestled since 1987, but had always said that his 1985 to 1987 tenure wrestling part-time in the WWF was a mistake that he did to help his son's career after his first retirement in 1981. He had been heavily critical of the direction pro wrestling had taken, between the increased drug use and the raunchier product, which sure would make him look bad if he were to go back into the business when both elements are seemingly at an all-time high. Apparently when he spoke with Cruz, the subject did come up how bad he's going to come across from that standpoint if he does participate, but he's willing to take the knocks. At this point nothing has been decided for the January 16th pay-per-view show. Nitro on December 20th in Baltimore drew 8,915 in the building, which was 4,589 paying $168,905. Medusa challenged anyone to a cruiserweight title match, then saw Buzzkill in the stands with a women's rights sign and challenged him. After Spice distracted the ref, who missed, Buzzkill hit the Russian leg sweep and the cover. Spice threw something to Medusa, who KO'd Buzzkill with it and pinned him in 137 with a German suplex. Hugh Morris, complete with a father, who looked like Hogan off steroids, as an escapee from the loony bin, lost to Hennig in 429 when Pops distracted Morris, and he fell prey to the fisherman suplex. Russo met with Piper. Piper had his son with him for sympathy. They apparently struck a deal, although what the deal wasn't made clear. Russo told Piper in his interview he needed to tell the fans that he was the one who screwed Goldberg and that he had sold out. Piper said that he was going to shoot and started talking terms like smarks and all that. Russo tried to claim that he was the one who scripted Montreal. That wasn't the case. Nash did the interview where he started swearing, talking about how the boys never screw the other boys because it violates the code of the wrestlers. That was really funny. Actually, it was his best interview in months. Tank Abbott no contest Jerry Flynn in 58 seconds. No reaction. Ref bump immediately and it was over. Actually I was expecting a ref bump in the Nash interview. They did a pull apart after and Abbott sucker punched him. People hated this. Revolution did an interview and told Duggan to renounce the US and burn the flag. Duggan wouldn't adhere to the stipulations, citing that wrestling stipulations are never adhered to. Actually he said that he lied and jumped Revolution. He actually said to hell with standards and practices before the filthy animals made the save. It was kind of funny to explain why 4 guys would run away from 3 guys. One of whom was half their size and on crutches to boot. Piper was screaming that he wasn't a phony and tried to get the fans to cheer for Goldberg. He then quit wrestling, claiming wrestling was better before there were script writers. Actually, it was, but that's another story. Piper begged Goldberg not to be a phony. He started talking about real fighters and I guess tried to still convince people that in his day wrestling was real. Hart came out and yelled at Russo, who said that he was just paying Hart back for his part in screwing him 2 years ago. Hart swore at him and vacated the title. Knobbs and Finlay beat Meng and Smiley in 307 when Knobbs pinned Smiley in the same bathroom of the Kevin Sullivan-Benoit match from a few years ago. Knobbs with his new haircut looks like Johnny Valiant. The guy who hangs out with Piper in the limo is former Northwest wrestler Bart Sawyer, who is called Steve because that's his real name. Maestro pinned Courageous with a knee to the back after Symphony distracted Courageous in 341. Way better match than you'd think. Maestro must be a hell of a worker. Chavo Guerrero Jr. then tried to sell Courageous a book about how to pick up women. Now that was funny. Piper started destroying Russo's office. He'd already left and was hanging in the limo, with a baseball bat screaming about Owen Hart, Adrian Adonis, and Andre. A weird 3-way saw Page versus Canyon versus Bigelow. Jay Biggs, manager of Canyon Clarence Mason in a previous life, lost his voice. Page laid both guys out, kissed a fan and then left for no reason. Canyon then broke another champagne bottle on Bigelow for the pin in 417. If the wrestlers don't care to even pin guys after they are laid out to win the match, why should we at home care who wins the matches? And if we don't care, what's the point of buying a pay-per-view show? Creative Control had a handicap match against Nash. Hall showed up on crutches and they destroyed Control with the crutches. Hall's injury must have been legit even though he was dancing around on a bad knee, because they wanted him to do the edge on one of the twins, and he said he couldn't because of the injury. Jarrett beat Benoit to win the US title in a return ladder match in 656. Mike Tenay tried to put their match the previous night over as the greatest ladder match in history. It was a stretch when they did the same thing a few weeks ago on WWF. But at least that one was arguable. But at least they're finally trying to get matches over and even tried to push it as match of the year. Benoit was awesome again. He's got to be a machine and not human. The finish was hilarious. Benoit went to climb the ladder but the steps on both sides broke because the ladder was gimmicked. The funny part is Benoit climbed and waited for the steps to collapse and they didn't. So he had to stomp as hard as he could on the steps for them to collapse. It was so stupid. Then Jarrett hit Benoit with a guitar. It was so un-Benoit-like, and I guess he proved he was in fact human and not machine, as he braced way too early and right in front of the camera to take the shot. Jarrett then grabbed a second ladder that he had put under the ring and climbed up to win the match. Jarrett was then told by Russo that finish was nothing and wait until you see the main event finish. Sid pinned Wall in 233 of a match even worse than it sounded after Berlin hit Wall with a missile dropkick. Sid power-bombed Berlin and shook hands with Wall after the match. Disco showed up at the offices of Tony Marinera's father, played by Chuck Zito. He told Disco he'd basically either murder him or he could join the family. Disco never answered. It's a pretty tough question. Either be dead, or hang around with bumbling fools like Vito and Johnny who when they actually wrestle can have good matches. The Varsity Club, with Christina Lom given the ring name of Leia Meow as their cheerleader, beat Harlem Heat in 713. Sullivan did commentary and tagged in. It makes as much sense as anything else. They're doing the same gimmick as 1988 where Rotunda always runs down Steiner as being stupid. Hey, it was a great gimmick 11 years ago and got Steiner over huge as a face. The lights went out and Midnight showed up. Stevie Ray got mad and began arguing with her and Rotunda schoolboyed him. PG-13 then came out of the crowd to attack the Varsity Club but ended up tripping on each other. Daphne Unger showed up as a weirdo trying to make it with the Misfits, but ended up giving Jerry only a low blow and then kissed him. Vampiro thought she was a weirdo also. Unger and David Flair came out to beat up David Penzer. David challenged Vampiro while Unger was laying the kicks in on Penzer. Flair hit Vampiro with the gold tire iron, which is actually made of rubber, and Unger pounded on Vampiro with the tire iron. Bagwell did an interview. At least they had the brains to try and explain the Page angle. Gene asked him if he was sleeping with Kimberly. He basically said if someone who looked like that was in your bed, would you kick them out? DDP came out and they brawled. It's a hell of a lot more effective to book an adultery angle if you actually let the public in on what the angle is. By the way, Kimberly on WCW Live announced her retirement from wrestling due to it putting pressure on her marriage. I think that's the 13th retirement in the last month in WCW. Piper gave a Canute Rockney speech to the babyfaces. The fans in the building were booing this one out of the building and chanting boring. He told the wrestlers to form a union and get a pension and medical coverage. Finally, after all the hype, Hart wrestled Goldberg and the match had no heat, especially as compared with the night before when the match was pretty intense before the finish. Ref bump. Hart used the figure 4 but Goldberg reversed. Hall and Nash came out with a bat, teased hitting Hart but of course hit Goldberg. They gave the bat to Hart and he hit Goldberg. Piper then did his run-in way before he was supposed to. The idea is that Hart was supposed to pin Goldberg and then Piper would jump on Goldberg to protect him. The problem was Piper jumped on Goldberg before Hart could pin him. Hart tried to pull him off, but in the angle Piper wasn't supposed to budge so he didn't. So in this great heat spot you had Hart and Nash laughing because of how silly it was. Ref Billy Silverman didn't know what to do either so he counted the pin with Piper on top. Piper I guess should have been world champion considering of late guys just run from the back and cover guys and are awarded wins. But not this time, as they simply announced it was a figment of all of our imaginations and it was Hart, not Piper, who had covered Goldberg and won the title. Jarrett came out and hit Piper with a guitar and the spray-painted NWO on Goldberg and Piper. And you thought there was no originality in that finish? They spray-painted it with silver paint. Thunder taping on December 21st in Salisbury, Maryland, before a very hot crowd of about 4,000. Before the show started, they taped 3 matches for Worldwide with Finlay and Knobs over Disorderly Conduct, Flynn over Frankie Lancaster and Canyon over Bobby He Still Lives Eaton. Thunder opened with an NWO interview. They are working very hard not to be cool babyfaces, as in particular, Hall and Nash kept insulting the audience and telling them how stupid they were for not seeing this coming and they pretty much got a heel response. The new NWO catchphrase is going to be, once you've had the black, you'll never go back. The idea is not to make the mistake of the Bischoff era and keep the NWO group small and not bury it down trying to use it to get charismatically challenged people over by wearing the t-shirt. Goldberg came out and vowed before the end of the night he'd get them one by one. PG-13 versus Varsity Club ended in a DDQ but Varsity Club beat them up after and hung one of them for Miss Meow to elbow them in the groin. They showed a David Flair vignette with Daphne Unger who is an actress they've scouted who is apparently really good at a fast food place going crazy because he's ordering a Salisbury steak in Salisbury and they don't have it. They did a bunch of Flair videos. Reports are that in these vignettes, the Flair character is great but the problem is, once you put him in the ring, he's still so green. Russo told Hennig that they were just using Creative Control, Shane and La Parka, that their gimmick stunk and they're down. Creative Control came in with motorcycles and then beat up Hennig. Duggan and Filthy Animals did a promo and Revolution came out with Douglas saying Duggan would renounce the US. Russo told Hennig that he's not in the NWO but he's still with him, and he and Jarrett had to face Control later in the show. Abbott destroyed Parka. He beat him up badly with stiff punches and Parka took a bad bump into the guardrail. The match ended and Parka needed help to the back. This was the first time they got over how dangerous Abbott was. Smiley beat Finlay in a hardcore title match. It went all over the building with Knobs and Meng both involved. Meng put Smiley on top of Finlay for the pin, but then put the death grip on Smiley. Goldberg finds Jarrett and has a chance to kill him but doesn't, but says to give a message to everyone else he'd get them before the show is over. Control came out in a biker gimmick and said their names were Ron and Don Harris. Hennig comes out but Jarrett double crosses him by no-showing so they beat up and pin Hennig. At this point the NWO came out and beat up the Harris twins and spray paint them and they're stretchered out. Maestro beat Bigelow when Canyon, who was at ringside doing color, interfered. Bigelow hit Biggs with a bottle, but then Canyon hit Bigelow with a title belt. They are introducing some sort of new title for Canyon, maybe replacing the World TV title with the World Movie title. DDP did an interview and said he wouldn't wrestle in WCW until he gets a match with Bagwell, selling the Kimberly deal. Courageous came out with Shane Helms and Shannon Moore as members of the rock group 3 Count. This was a Rock and Roll Express spoof meant to turn them heel in the Kurt Angle mode. They played a music video of them and the crowd hated it. Chavo Guerrero Jr. came out and cleaned house on all of them. Flair and Daphne were at a gas station where they met a guy working at the gas station who they called Crowbar and befriended him, Chris Ford aka Devon Storm. Storm has been looking great in recent WCW Saturday night matches. It ended up in a brawl with Crowbar, Daphne and Flair being jumped by Vampiro and the Misfits. Konnan and Kidman and Duggan beat Saturn and Malenko and Ossia in a real good match, mainly being Kidman getting killed by Saturn and Malenko. For the finish, Mysterio Jr. hit Saturn and Malenko with his crutches and Konnan and Kidman double pinned them. Nash, subbing for DDP, the latest guy who has quit, wrestled Wall ending with an NWO run-in and they spray-painted Wall. He's stretchered out and they go to take him in an ambulance but he went berserk backstage. Hall and Nash are talking. Hall said he needs to see the trainer about his knee. The trainer turns out to be Goldberg who takes him out. Nash says he needs to take a shower, and Goldberg beats him up in the shower. Main event is Benoit vs. Hart for the title, in what was said to have been a good match but only 6 minutes or so. Jarrett lays out Benoit with a guitar for the DQ. Goldberg runs in and lays out Jarrett, while Hart runs off. Goldberg is chasing Hart, who jumps in a car and drives off. Goldberg then sees Russo's limo in the parking lot and starts smashing the windows as the show goes off the air, with them building up the idea that Nitro will have another Goldberg vs. Hart title match. It was after the show ended that they realized Goldberg was actually hurt. Shivani Hudson and Tenay will become the regular announcing team for Thunder starting this week. On December 29th, TNT will be airing a 3-hour Best of Nitro history show. Among the matches that will air will be the first match in Nitro history in September 1995 featuring Jushin Liger against the late Brian Pillman. Fans of the house shows generally laugh when David Flair is shown on the screen or comes down the aisle. Absolutely useless wrestling trivia. When Ric Flair was growing up in Edina, Minnesota, he used to work as a paper boy. One of the people he delivered papers for was Mad Dog Vachon. Thunder was taped December 14th in Mobile, Alabama, which included Paul Bearer being backstage at the show. He lives there. Vicious came out for an interview and Hennig came out with Creative Control, Shane, and Parka. Benoit came out to somewhat even things up until it was announced Sid must wrestle Benoit or both guys would be suspended for 6 months with no pay. Sting attacked DDP backstage. Bagwell beat Vampiro with the blockbuster in 3:37. Williams and Oklahoma distracted Vampiro, ending with Oklahoma spraying lethal barbecue sauce on Vampiro to set up the pin. Williams powerbombed Vampiro and poured the sauce all over him. The artist character was furthered to never talking, and Paisley did the talking for him. In another way of killing the Cruiserweight title, Prince beat Courageous in 2:06. Juventud Guerrera called it the Jabroni match of the week. Spice came out with Courageous. Medusa and Spice went at it and Prince gave Courageous a rolling reverse cradle, except Courageous' shoulders were clearly up during the count. Guerrera thought it was a title change, except it wasn't because a guy like Prince is too important to hold such a jobber title. Medusa slapped Courageous after the match. Guerrera, when Paisley, Spice, Medusa and Courageous were in there, said there were 4 women in the ring. Duggan and Midnight beat Saturn and Ossia in 7:20 when Douglas accidentally hit Saturn with the cast and Duggan hit him with a 2x4. They also had Booker T and Stevie Ray argue about Midnight. Revolution beat up Duggan after the match before singer Aaron Neville, a longtime wrestling fan, made the save for him with a 2x4. Smiley no contest David Flair in a hardcore title match. Boy was this bad. Meng came out and destroyed Flair and the match just ended at 1:55. Flair had a nervous breakdown in the ring. Sting challenged Luger. Liz got bumped and Luger hit Sting with a bat for the DQ in 2:59. Williams beat Wall via DQ when Berlin interfered in 3:04, hitting Williams with Oklahoma's boot. Wall decked Berlin after the match. Rhodes beat Hennig via DQ in 2:27 when Jarrett broke a guitar over Rhodes' head. Benoit and Sid were supposed to wrestle but it ended up being 2-on-5 with Benoit and Sid against Control and Shane and Hennig and Parka. Benoit brought out the ladder but the heels were DQ'd in 1:48 for using it. Canyon beat DDP in 4:30 when David Flair hit Page with a tire iron. Good match. Canyon also cracked a bottle over Bigelow's head when he tried to make the save. Main event was a House of Pain cage match where the object was to handcuff the other team to the cage. Billed as Hall and Nash defending the tag titles against Hart and Goldberg. Hall wasn't there due to the knee injury, so they ended up with Control and Jarrett and Nash all beating on Hart until Goldberg saved him. Piper came out but Jarrett KO'd him with a guitar. Then hit Goldberg with a guitar but Goldberg shrugged it off and speared him. Nash hit Goldberg with an object and ended up with Piper, Hart and Goldberg all handcuffed to the cage and Nash and Jarrett for some reason being announced as the winners. At this point it appears better than 50-50 that Randy Savage will work out his money problems and stay. Hart was originally asked to on Nitro to do the same interview Michaels did in Ottawa the day after the Survivor Series. He didn't want to play the angle up like that, so they tweaked it a little. The general speculation is that Russo wanted this angle to portray that he should get credit with the general public for Montreal as being an angle he created with the idea that's what turned around the WWF. Juventud Guerrera had his elbow operation on December 20th and should be back in the ring in early February. Although the gig of him announcing really ran its course on the December 16th Thunder, the reason he's not on the December 23rd Thunder is more due to the surgery than a final decision being made to end the gimmick. Eddie Guerrero looks to be back in around 3 weeks. Silly quote of the week was Diamond Dallas Page in USA Today last week regarding the WWF toning down SmackDown. Page said, "I find it hard to believe they'll water down their product. I think people feed of controversy and it'll be the highest rated show on Thursday." Actually, the first half of that statement is the general belief that they'll tone it down until it doesn't become a hot media issue and go back to what it once was. But that it will be the highest rated show on Thursday. Get in the real world, guys. Ever heard of Friends and Frasier and ER out of the 6 network shows? Even though SmackDown is UPN's star show, it ranks 5th virtually every week, including the week it got all that pub, only beating out WB programming. Next thing you know, someone from WCW will be talking about how Nitro beats Monday Night Football in the ratings. The Sporting News listed Bill Goldberg at number 87 in its list of the 100 most powerful men in sports. How Goldberg made the list and Vince McMahon, or even Vince Russo, didn't is an interesting question. Probably because Goldberg has real credibility in the sports world because he was a legit star college football player and played pro ball. McMahon still should have been on the list. Eric Bischoff is still interested in returning as the manager of Hulk Hogan. Due to the Japanese fascination with freaky-looking women, Midnight Anna Marie Crooks is already getting mainstream newspaper press regarding the idea of a 6'3" muscular woman wrestler. I don't think she's really 6'3", although she does appear to be taller than Nicole Bass, who wasn't really 6'3" when she wasn't wearing high boots, as she was considerably shorter than Val Venus when she was out there barefooted, or Chyna, who is really 5'9" but wears huge heels. The December 13th Philadelphia Inquirer ran an original Washington Post story about Goldberg with a Jewish gimmick, comparing him with Sandy Koufax and Mark Spitz as a standout in fields that Jews had never stood out in before. Actually, there have been a number of Jewish wrestling stars over the years and currently, including the Malenko family, Raven and Mark Lewin in another era. Goldberg's role in wrestling is actually being featured in a book called Searching for My Brothers, Jewish Men in a Gentile World. Former WWF ref Jack Doan may be starting here. House shows for the week saw Thunder taping on December 14th in Mobile, Alabama, draw 1,797, plus 2,092 comps, paying $38,255. December 17th in Daytona Beach, Florida, drew 2,341, paying $50,810, and December 18th in Jacksonville, Florida for an afternoon show drew 3,193, paying $69,625. Merchandise from December 13th to December 19th was $83,404, which worked out to $4.09, which is the lowest weekly merchandise figure for WCW in many years, which is another example of none of the wrestlers really being over enough to move merchandise. Daytona and Jacksonville were both headlined by Hart over Goldberg via DQ in matches where Nash did run-ins. They advertised appearances by Hall and Nash, and Hall wasn't there due to his injury. There were some complaints noting that mid-carders who are injured are strongly encouraged to make their house show appearances, and that Hall lived very close to both cities, and Nash just got involved in the finish. Ric Flair worked both shows and was put over Luger with a figure 4. Conan must be in the major doghouse, as he worked both shows in the opening match, putting over Jerry Flynn. WWF, very early estimates of the Armageddon pay-per-view are that it did between an 0.90 and 0.97 buy rate, which would be around a $4.6 million company gross. In about 35% of the homes it was very difficult to order the show at the last minute because the 800 number went dead, although there were backups, so if one wanted to order it bad enough they would be able to. We were among the homes that couldn't dial the 800 number at the last minute because of a software failure, but it was relatively easy and only minorly annoying to dial directly to the cable company and order the show. That is significantly up from the rock bottom pay-per-view in December of last year that did an 0.78 buy rate, which would be the first time in several months that a WWF pay-per-view significantly beat out what it did the previous year. It still looks that the Royal Rumble main event will be Triple H versus Mick Foley in some form, which possibly would mark the return of Cactus Jack. The original plan of Triple H to win the title from Big Show was most likely delayed by Triple H's knee injury. He's expected to be good enough to start wrestling this weekend, which may mean the title change would be imminent if plans aren't changed. Due to the political situation regarding the proposed buyout of TSN by CTV and Sports.net in Canada, WWF afternoon programming will be dropped under pressure from the Canadian Radio Television Commission, CRTC. It was announced on December 16. The change goes into effect in February. The CRTC has had numerous complaints, as had TSN, regarding the content of wrestling shows, but the shows are so highly rated they've basically tried to edit them, which has become harder when Raw airs live on Mondays. The CRTC is said to have been pressuring TSN to drop all potential afternoon showings of pro wrestling, including potential showings of WCW, in particular the Tuesday 4 p.m. Eastern Time replay showing of Raw, as a concession in not going after the higher-rated primetime shows and in appearing to publicly do something regarding the complaints about wrestling at the same time as approving the sale. In something not spoken about in any media articles on the subject, this puts a major damper on the Tuesday off-the-record show which followed the Tuesday Raw, giving it a super-hot lead-in. When McMahon did his last off-the-record series of interviews, the during almost a puff interview with Vince and Linda, after host Michael Landsberg did a great job on the first interview of Vince alone, Landsberg asked the two if they felt they were responsible broadcasters, and they responded that they were because they don't air Raw during afternoon hours. The decision was made, rather than embarrass them with airing that or following up on it since Raw aired in the afternoon actually as a lead-in for that very show. A comment was edited off the show. After the decision was made, TSN claimed it was their decision and not one they were pressured into, claiming that the responsible thing to do is to broadcast Raw at hours when it's less likely children are watching. Of course, nobody made a numbers comparison as how many children watch Raw on Monday nights as opposed to Tuesday afternoons in Canada. The CRTC wrote a letter stating they were very concerned about the availability of Raw during hours young viewers are likely to be watching, but then stated they were referring to the late afternoon time slot. The CRTC has had 31 complaints filed with them against Raw, concerns that included violence, adult content, simulated sexual activities, vulgar gestures, profane language, racist and sexist portrayals of blacks and women and depiction of Satanism. CRTC Secretary General Ursula Menck noted in her letter to TSN in particular the portrayal of women. The Winnipeg Free Press wrote the story up as if it was a victory for the Winnipeg School Division over the WWF in their long-standing dispute. There is no word about TSN moving or not moving a 3-hour Wednesday afternoon showing of Nitro. Austin's surgery has now been moved up to January 11th due to another cancellation giving him an earlier date. This change actually gives him almost a chance, if everything goes perfectly, that he could wrestle at Mania. Austin's head will be immobilized in a halo for 6 weeks after the surgery. There was an argument at the December 14th SmackDown show between McMahon and Jericho. Most first-hand sources claim the situation was blown out of proportion by the time the word got out, but that there most definitely was a situation. McMahon criticized Jericho's ring work as it regards psychology in the ring, along with his timing and persona. Jericho apparently got right back and didn't back down, although reports were he was never unprofessional nor were their disagreements ever escalating to full-scale yelling, recognizing or believing that McMahon was actually falling for the DX line, much of which was identical to the Kevin Nash line when he was in WCW. As to why Jericho can't make it as a main eventer. There was criticism that Jericho was getting over as a face while the role he was intended for was to be a heel, although there is a feeling a lot of that is because of the situations the company put him in and just the nature of fans today when it comes to someone who gives entertaining interviews. It's been pretty clear from almost the start that DX has gotten word about to McMahon and others with the belief that Jericho wasn't ready for main events and wasn't a good worker. Some is because of their claim he potatoed China in one of their early meetings. It is true that in the ring Jericho hasn't been nearly as good, particularly in television matches, as he was during most of his WCW tenure, but he's also not working with nearly the caliber of opponents that he had been, and his strength is not in carrying so-so workers to good matches. Triple H on the Thanksgiving SmackDown even looked at one of the homeless people and made a comment about one being a loser like Bam Bam Bigelow, who the Clique always buried to everyone, and said another can't work, just like Jericho. Many feel most of this was carefully intended because Jericho was the one newcomer who had the charisma to jump past all of them on the pecking order, and this is a very insecure business, and that is how it often operates. There are reports out that McMahon offered to let Jericho have his release if he wasn't happy. Things settled down quickly and he was seen at the tapings talking with Triple H and China for everyone to smooth everything over, with the idea that want Jericho now to turn face and work with X-Pac, and at least from the management standpoint, want X-Pac to teach him more ring psychology. Jim Ross on the WWF website denied reports of a release being offered. Others have insisted it is true, but Jericho never asked for the release, so it's a moot point whether it was offered or not. and also claimed that there was nobody from the other company, in reference to the story of Kevin Nash basically putting the words in Triple H's mouth, influencing what went down. The humorous part of all this is that if Jericho was a bad worker, which he isn't, since when has bad ring work gotten in the way of the WWF pushing someone with top-of-the-line charisma? It's so clear the fans take him as probably one of the 4 most charismatic performers currently in the company. Of course, if he were to be pushed at the number 4 star level, who would that shoot him past? The general feeling is that everything out of the situation ended on a positive note. Raw Christmas on December 20th in Houston drew a sellout 12,063, paying $349,425. It was another show booked by Triple H and Stephanie. Outlaws beat Test in a handicap match in 326 when Gunn used the Famouser and Dog pinned him. Jeff Hardy and Christian beat Matt Hardy and Edge in 510 when Jeff pinned Matt after a 450 splash. Pretty hot match. Matt was accidentally busted open and kind of knocked silly when Jeff used a senton on him and their heads collided and you could see the blood flying out of Matt's head, probably from the nose. He was shaken up after the match. They showed a replay of Stephanie giving JR a Kenta Kobashi chop to the head from SmackDown. Triple H and Stephanie called out JR to do him in regarding Ross' comments about her. She shoved down JR when Triple H was right behind him. Triple H was about to break JR's arm when Mankind came out. Stephanie slapped him before it was over. Angle beat Viscera in 153 with his fireman's carry suplex finish. Blackman hit Viscera with the kendo stick to lead to the finish. The reason Blackman, who was feuding with Angle, helped him was because Stephanie double-crossed Triple H, who had booked it because he was jealous that Stephanie liked Angle. In a continued 3-way, Dudley's over Acolytes and Moolah and Mae Young in 129 when Devon came off the top rope with a headbutt to Young's crotch and Bubba pinned her. The Acolytes never touched the grannies but the Dudleys were punching them out. Dudleys kept beating on them until Henry made the save. Henry is the least convincing actor I've ever seen in a play, acting like the woman he's with is his love interest and I can't figure out why. Mankind had a boiler room match with Santa. Mankind told the first Santa to lose and he'd put him over. At that point, 3 more Santas attacked Mankind but he beat them up. Then 2 more Santas, clearly the Outlaws, attacked him and he laid them out. Finally a last Santa, who was Triple H, clobbered Mankind and laid him out, and then went out the door. With Christmas music playing, I guess being Santa's entrance music, Teddy Long, totally deadpan, raised Triple H's arm outside the boiler room and said that Santa Claus was the winner. Jericho kept the IC belt, beating Godfather in 244 when Chyna gave Godfather a low blow. In a topless top rope match, Val Venus vs. Bob Holly became the biggest ratings draw of the night. Officially Holly won in 3 minutes and BB was topless, but Triple H hit her breasts from anyone's sight. BB didn't want to take her bra off but Triple H told her if she didn't, she'd be fired. So she did. Snow beat Rock in a bull rope match in 544 when both Outlaws interfered. Dog hit Rock with a chair but he kicked out. Gunn used the Famouser on Rock and he didn't kick out. The posse, who were playing tuxedo servants for Triple H and Stephanie, got so excited about Rock losing that Rodney knocked a drink all over Stephanie. Tori came in and she was really looking freaky, like this cross between a female impersonator and the Ultimate Warrior. Anyway, the stips were if Kane didn't win the title, then she had to spend the holidays with X-Pac. As the posse's punishment, they faced Too Cool and Rikishi. Rikishi bonsai'd abs and pinned Rodney in 409 after a piledriver and they danced, which the crowd loved. Finally, in absolutely the best match Kane has ever had with Big Show, First Show was DQ'd for hitting Kane with a chair. Triple H and Stephanie explained it was no DQ. Then both were counted out. Triple H said it was falls count anywhere and there were no count-outs. Kane actually did a plancha early and Show took a big bump over the barricade. The Outlaws interfered again and it wound up with Show powerbombing Kane through a table and scoring the pin at 644. And the Outlaws then grabbed Tori at ringside, I guess to bring her to X-Pac. SmackDown taping on December 21st in Dallas notes. The show opened with a dark match with Papi Chulo over Steve Bradley. They missed more moves than in Houston but the Dallas crowd was more into the match. Mideon beat Tom Howard with a lot of boring chants. For Heat on December 26th, Venus beat Abs to keep the European title. Venus' left knee was wrapped up. He won with a fisherman suplex. Brown double count out Albert. Too Cool beat Bangers. The Bangers come up wearing fake breasts. Mosh used his fake breast as a weapon. Gangrel pinned Godfather when Luna sprayed red mist in Godfather's eyes. Luna actually came down as Godfather's hoe, basically doing the same angle as Medusa and Spice the night before, then turning on Godfather. SmackDown opened with Mankind saying wrestling under Triple H and Stephanie wasn't worth it anymore. Stephanie came out and said she, not Triple H, was in charge and this was all about business. She gave Mankind a title match with Triple H suspended 15 feet above the ring in a cage. Jericho beat Holly via DQ to keep the IC title. Jericho had Bob in the walls of Jericho when Crash interfered and hit Jericho with the title belt. Chyna and Miss Cat attacked Crash to make the save. The Outlaws told Triple H that since he was married to Stephanie, he should get the title shot. Stephanie went to Kane and asked him to be her bodyguard, and in return Kane could get a match with any DX member and started telling him what Tori and X-Pac were doing. Kane agreed. Rikishi beat Viscera with the Banzai. Rikishi and Too Cool danced again. Test beat Road Dogg after hitting him with his mask and using the meltdown and elbow off the top for the win. Test continued to beat on Road Dogg until officials stopped him. Outlaws and Triple H came to confront Stephanie. The two argued. Stephanie said the sex was great but business was business and she was in charge. Triple H said he wouldn't leave the room and Stephanie brought in police officers to take him out. Angle beat Edge. After a ref bump, Blackman hit Edge with a kendo stick. Snow got mad at Stephanie, saying he beat Rock and deserves a title match, not Foley. Stephanie said if he could beat Rock again, he'd get a title match on Raw. In a cage match, of course, Rock pinned Snow with the People's Elbow. Ivory did an interview. She said Miss Kitty went too far at Armageddon and said this was sports entertainment, not adult entertainment. She challenged Kitty to a match. Kitty agreed as long as it was no DQ. Ivory agreed. Chyna then came in and destroyed Ivory with a pedigree in no time flat and Kitty jumped on her to the pin. The posse then talked to Taka and Funaki and talked about liking Chinese, but Taka and Funaki said they were Japanese. Christian and Jeff Hardy beat Kaientai in a good match. Hardy pinned Funaki with the senton. The posse got mad at Kaientai, who dropkicked them out of the ring. Kane beat Billy Gunn with a choke slam. He was about to tombstone him outside the ring, but Gunn rammed Kane into the post. They brawled until Road Dogg told Kane he knew where Tori was. Mark Henry came out with Moolah and Young and read a love poem to Young. The Dudleys told Henry to shut up and called him an idiot. Bubba did his ECW routine, ripping on the crowd, and didn't stutter. Bubba had a singles match with Henry ending when Devon tried to interfere, but Moolah and Young shook the ropes. Henry came back and splashed Bubba. Show no contest, Mankind in the title match. Stephanie did color. Crowd was totally dead, paying more attention to a beach ball in the crowd. Triple H was hung in a cage above the ring. As Mankind got the Sacco cloth, the cage magically was dropped into the ring. Test, Ed, Christian and Jeff Hardy. Matt apparently missed the show due to the injury the night before, also hit the ring. Stephanie and Triple H argued. Mankind went to hit Triple H, but he put Stephanie in front. Stephanie then kicked Mankind and Triple H hit the ref and Mankind, both with chains. Outlaws attacked Mankind and Show. It ended up with Stephanie and Triple H hugging, with everything that had taken place beforehand being a ruse. After the show went off, Triple H and Stephanie left and the Outlaws took a beating from Mankind and Show, and Mankind did a people's elbow on both. On the replay showing of Armageddon, they edited out the shot of Miss Kitty showing her breasts, I guess due to the pressure from wherever the pressure came from. Actually, it was edited on cable but not on satellite, which may mean the heat came from viewers' choice, which has put heat on PPVs in the past that have gotten too risque and have kept promotions from doing things like barbed wire matches. L. Brent Bozell of the PTC did write something up about the Miss Kitty deal. SmackDown taped December 14th in Tallahassee, Florida opened with this really campy team meeting with Triple H and Stephanie in charge giving orders. Rock was in a school desk looking really distracted. Started with Jericho versus Prince Albert for the IC title. Chyna came out and gave Albert a low blow and Jericho pinned him with a K-Brata in 2:43. Stephanie and Triple H agreed it was a good match, which stems from the at least semi-public makeup. Stephanie and Triple H had a really funny argument afterwards, ending with Stephanie saying she wanted to go to ringside and watch Angle wrestle. Angle beat Test via DQ when Stephanie ordered the bell being rung because Test threw a closed fist in 2:55. DX attacked Test after the match. They showed blood on Test later. In a match which took place because Triple H was trying to wear down potential tag title opponents of the Outlaws by having them fight each other, Matt Hardy pinned Jeff Hardy in the best WWF TV match in a while when Jeff Sleeper was maneuvered by Matt into a reverse DDT in 5:23. By the way, add Tori to the list of women in wrestling who can't act. Posse all attacked Kane. X-Pac pinned Tori in 41 with an X-Factor. Mankind beat Snow in 8:01 in a Falls Count Anywhere match with all the garbage can lid shots, etc. Edge beat Christian in another good match. Acolytes beat Posse. Too Cool and Rikishi Fatu beat Hollies and Viscera. Outlaws kept the tag titles, beating Patterson and Briscoe. Main event of Rock vs. Show for the title in a lumberjack match with all heel lumberjacks ended with no winner as Rock and Show fought the heels together and cleaned house on them. WWF The Music dropped to number 49 on the charts this week, even though sales were actually up to 74,929 because it was a huge week due to Christmas in the industry. WCW Mayhem fell to number 121 with 24,884 sales. SmackDown tapings on December 14th in Tallahassee, Florida drew a sellout 6,531, paying $158,668 for that show, and the December 20th Raw merchandise totaled $138,018 or $7.41 per head. Victor Quiñones promoted two IWA shows using mainly WWF talent called WWF Christmas in Puerto Rico before 7,800 paying about $180,000 on December 15th at the Roberto Clemente Coliseum in San Juan, and 3,200 paying $48,000 in Como on December 16th, which included the return of The Undertaker. Originally it was to be Undertaker vs. Kane as the main event, but with Undertaker still not near 100%, and having gained some poundage because he's limited in the training he can do, they switched it to a tag match with Godfather teaming with Kane and Viscera teaming with Undertaker. The next night in Como, Puerto Rico, instead of the singles main event, they did a trios with Undertaker and Viscera and Mideon over Vega and Perez and Kane. Castillo ran out and tried to hit Mideon with a chair, but he moved and accidentally hit Vega, and Viscera splashed him for the pin. Venus also came out for the finish and Perez chased him away. At this point, Royal Rumble still looks like the hoped-for target date for Undertaker to return inside the ring. He really couldn't do much and was very limited in the ring, and there were some fans catcalling him about that. He did the show since he was the main drawing card, and he made the commitment some time back, and he's good friends with Vega, who along with Perez and Quiñones are running the office. They used Miguel Perez Sr., who was a huge draw in the Northeast in the late 50s, as Antonino Rocca's tag team partner in an angle. It started with Val Venus arguing with Perez Sr., and later on the Titantron during a Road Dogg vs. Miguel Perez Jr. match, they showed Venus attacking Perez Sr. in the dressing room, and Perez Jr. ran out of the ring, losing via countout. The weird thing is that Road Dogg, a WWF heel, or at least that's what he was supposed to be, was cheered above Puerto Rican local Perez Jr. The Hardy Boys were also cheered against Puerto Rican's Ricky Banderas, who Quiñones wants to push as a main star once he gets his own territory going, and Ricky Santana, but that worked out okay since Santana was turning on Banderas after the match anyway. They also used Sean Stasiak, since Quiñones had booked him for the tour before he was fired by the WWF. The next shows are January 6th and January 7th, with the second show in Mayagüez, and will include a tournament to crown the IWA Tag Team Champions. Among those on that tour are DX Headbangers, Brown Henry, Mideon, Crash Holly, Taka Michinoku, Sho Funaki, Gangrel, Luna Venus, and Albert. A 21-year-old student from England at Shawn Michaels School was critically injured last week, taking a backdrop and landing on his head and neck. As of midweek, he was down to 12% brain function. Michaels, who has no insurance, is covering the hospital bills and flew family members in. By the end of the week, he was making a comeback but was still in very rough shape. With the bills mounting up fast, Michaels has told people that if he does get sued, he may have to return to the ring. Regarding Michaels working the ECW pay-per-view show, as of press time there still had been no request made by either Michaels or Paul Heyman to Vince McMahon regarding appearing on the show. While not definite, the feeling by those in the company close to the situation is McMahon at this point wouldn't want Michaels at this point in time to appear on anyone's television but his own. Paul Heyman has pretty well given up on the idea of using Michaels for January 9th, and with Michaels' wife, the former Nitro girl, due to give birth any day now, the timing wouldn't be good anyway. Heyman is now hoping to talk about doing a 1 or 2 shot appearance, which wouldn't be a match in March. Reverend Christopher Rose's annual list of the most warped toys aimed at children in 1999 saw 3 of the top 10 on the list being pro wrestling toys. Number 2 was a Buff Bagwell action figure of the WCW wrestler in a wheelchair. Remember when Bagwell actually sat in the wheelchair as a gimmick when he came back from the legit neck injury, which has an ejection button which has him fly out of the wheelchair. Number 3 was the Al Snow action figure with the mannequin head in a suitcase. Number 8 was the WWF's casket match toy. In the New York Post page 6 column, they had a preview on the ghost-written autobiography of The Rock, which comes out in early January. Didn't say much other than recount some youthful indiscretions about being 14 and lying to an 18-year-old girl to get her into bed. Now that's something nobody has ever done. Mentioning him getting drunk at a wedding and attacking someone in a high school fight he got into with Kevin Patrick. who played with the San Diego Chargers later in life. The first chapter is already up on the internet and it is said to be okay. Phil Mushnick in the New York Post on December 19 wrote about the Miss Kitty baring her breasts, basically laughing about the claim it was an accident. Both Kitty and Jerry Lawler missed TV in Houston because it coincided with the Hollywood premiere of Man on the Moon. From those who have seen the premiere, the reports are that Carrie did a masterful job, and that the wrestling sequences are far from the highlight of the movie. X-Pac missed the tapings this week because he had previously gotten the time off to take his family on vacation, while British Bulldog missed the tapings due to a bruised shoulder. Regarding rumors of Bryan Adams and Brian Clark coming in as the new Demolition, we're told there is nothing to it and that when their names came up since Adams was in Tampa at Raw on December 13 looking for work, that Vince McMahon's reaction was that he wasn't interested in him at this time. There have been no conversations at press time with Clark. Jim Ross basically wrote the same thing on the WWF website. Ken Shamrock is still interested in fighting in 2000. D'Lo Brown was on the WWF Internet Audio Show saying that he had 14 months left on his contract and wasn't going anywhere. Austin is pretty well going on the assumption that after the surgery he's going to be returning. The marriage to Deborah Marshall is said to be pretty much imminent. Taz will be spelled Taz, apparently because Time Warner owns the name Taz. The latest as it pertains to a relationship with DSC in Japan is that another meeting is scheduled for January 12 in Chicago, the day after the SmackDown tapings at the Allstate Arena. Again, DSC is attempting to get a WWF representative to attend their Tokyo Dome show on January 30 to start building anticipation for a show later in the year. Entertainment Weekly named the WWF the fifth most entertaining act of 1999 and ran the story featuring Vince McMahon and The Rock. Ricky Martin was number 1. Starting with the Royal Rumble, the American pay-per-view shows in the UK are moving from Sky to Channel 4, which outbids Sky for the rights. Channel 4 will also air Sunday Night Heat, which had never aired in the UK. WWFE stock hit an all-time low of 14th of March 16th on December 20th, before closing the week at press time on December 21st at 14.15.16. The day after the stock hit its all-time low point, the WWF sent out a press release announcing that they had sold 3 major arena shows out the first day tickets went on sale. The press release talked about the shows in Trenton, San Jose and the Royal Rumble in Madison Square Garden. The information was all accurate, but it was also a press releasing talking about something that had taken place 18 days earlier. The press release also noted that WrestleMania on April 2nd at the Arrowhead Pond in Anaheim, California is already sold out. Guess the January 22nd radio show the night before Rumble isn't a one-time thing, but plans are to make it a regular weekly 2-hour show from 8 to 10 p.m. called WWF on Westwood 1. The Reader's Pages. British Wrestling History. The history of U.S. wrestling in the United Kingdom needs clarifying. Reader Chris Hodgson made some excellent points in his letter in the November 8th issue, especially that WCW could make a killing in the UK market if they got their act together, but he also made a few errors. WCW Worldwide is certainly not the first U.S. show to have network exposure in the UK around 12 years ago. Before the advent of cable or satellite in the UK, the WWF had a very late night slot, as in 4 a.m., on the ITV network. At the same time, the first minor league attempts at cable TV in the UK, which virtually nobody could get or would want to get, also ran WWF television, including WrestleMania V. The impact of this exposure was negligible at best, but someone must have taken notice because when Rupert Murdoch's Sky Satellite Network started up in 1989, it signed nearly off of the WWF programming. WWF quickly became a major selling point of the Sky package. WWF hit a major peak in the early 90s, running 2 major tours in a 1-year period, before the fad of seeing American wrestling died out, leaving only the hardcore fan base. As you yourself have noted many times in The Observer, British wrestling was once massively mainstream, achieving a weekly audience of 14 million fans in the 80s before a WCW-like cocktail. Bad booking, predictable and poor main events, no new stars being created and old farts with political power keeping themselves over at the expense of the product. Killed the business. Let's get this straight. This was not a fad that fizzled out. Pro wrestling had been massively popular in England for generations. The rapid decline in the 1980s came as a complete shock to everyone in the industry. Some UK fans and historians have tried to explain this rapid decline. Sudden death may be a more accurate explanation, by pointing to specific events, such as when The Sun, our biggest selling newspaper, exposed pro wrestling as fake. That sort of rationale to me cuts no ice and is almost as stupid as some of Eric Bischoff's excuses for WCW's recent decline. I believe UK wrestling lost its traditional fan base when the more athletic, old NWA style of wrestling was replaced with the Big Daddy crap. Slowly, the longtime fans turned off. Nobody noticed at the time because Big Daddy brought in a load of casual fans. Of course, that Big Daddy fad burned itself out, the casual fad fans left, and suddenly the entire industry had walked into an elephant trap. However, there was still a market for wrestling. With no real domestic scene, WWF and Sky lucked into a ready-made market. WWF wrestlers were massive compared to what UK fans were used to. The whole presentation was fresh and exciting. Quickly the WWF filled the vacuum for the traditional fans, and the new concept attracted a new fad audience as well. From late 1990 through mid-1993, the WWF's popularity was absolutely massive. Around 1993, the WWF remained a staple of Sky's programming, but was losing popularity. During this time, ITV began to broadcast US wrestling. They started with those atrocious WCW Disney tapings, but even they pulled great ratings, averaging 6 million viewers per week because of a strong Saturday afternoon time slot, which was the traditional time slot for UK wrestling from the old days. WCW was drawing millions of more television viewers than WWF at this point, but never exploited the market except for a few half-assed tours which were never promoted in a professional manner. The WWF hit big again in 1997 and has since owned the market. The Attitude format was a natural winner in the smut-loving UK market. Which brings us to the present. WCW Worldwide is broadcast on Channel 5, which is a network station. But for reasons too technological and boring to go into, it can't be received nationwide and thus doesn't represent the golden ticket that WCW had with its ITV show a few years back. However, if Channel 5 started airing nitros and pay-per-view shows, WCW could really take off. There is no question about that. TNT Europe is a lame duck station, and they are totally clueless. For months they were advertising Nitro and Thunder as if they were presented by two different wrestling companies. It took them 18 months to figure out that Nitro was the name of a television show and that WCW was the name of the wrestling company. If WCW is serious about breaking into the UK market, they should put all their efforts into striking a major deal with Channel 5, which must include showing PPVs for free, even if it's on a tape-delayed basis. Mr. Hodgson wrote he was sure the majority of WCW fans in the UK would buy their PPVs. I'm not. Pay-per-view in this country is a new concept and only big boxing shows have drawn any real money. Those shows are usually 8 hours long and heavily loaded with live fights from England before taking the US feed for the big money fights. The WWF's UK-only pay-per-view events have not attracted strong buy rates, although they could improve if they stopped presenting below-par shows which ignore the current storylines. The WWF hasn't gotten that we receive the top-quality US pay-per-view shows for free, and are unlikely over the long term to pay £12 for a poor-quality show which insults our intelligence by ignoring angles from the previous month. If WWF, which spent years building up a UK fan base by touring and mentioning our friends in the UK on almost every pay-per-view show, can't draw good buy rates, I doubt WCW, who have totally ignored the UK despite at various times having Hogan, Hart, and Bulldog, could do any better. Then there's the problem of a Turner company needing to use a Murdoch company, Sky, to make money on pay-per-view. I can't see any WCW shows airing on Murdoch channels, let alone with PPVs on Sky. Even given what I've written, I think WCW can make inroads into the WWF-dominated UK market. Without a doubt Hart, Hogan, and Randy Savage, who fans remember from the early 90s when WWF did mega business, are the key assets to WCW in this country. It will also be vital to present something UK fans have never seen before. Doing a Nitro from the UK would be a great example of this. The 1992 SummerSlam and the 1997 One Night Only as the exceptions, the WWF has never included the UK shows into its storylines. Angles are totally ignored in the US and written-out characters are brought back to fill holes in the card with no attempt at an explanation. It seems like the bookers and the performers treat the UK shows as an inconvenience when they'd rather have a holiday. If WCW did a properly pushed Nitro show from here, headlined by Hart, Hogan, and Savage, they will go some way to creating a market for themselves. UK fans are very vocal. They'll make that Nitro look like a big-time deal, something Nitro hasn't looked like for quite a while. It will be a struggle for WCW, much like things are in general for the company, to break into this market, but it can be done. Anthony Evans. Newcastle-under-Lyme, Staffs, UK. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine.